Tonight's story is about something that might seem unusual for sleep. Cities during wartime, places where people felt afraid. But here is the gentle truth I want you to understand before we begin. We are not going to live through that fear. We're going to look back at it from the safety of today, from the comfort of wherever you are right now, and find something peaceful in the knowing that all of that has passed. Every single person who felt that fear has found their rest now. The cities rebuilt themselves, brick by brick, year by year. Children who hid during air raids grew old in peacetime. The sirens went silent. So settle in a little deeper. Let the weight of your body press into the warmth beneath you. And let's walk together through these 101 gentle facts. Not to feel the fear those cities felt, but to honor how that fear eventually ended. How peace returned, and how very far away all of that is from this quiet, safe moment you are in right now. Fact 1. On the morning of September 7th, 1940, London entered a chapter of its history that would last 57 consecutive nights. German bombers arrived over the city that evening in a vast formation, and what followed was the beginning of what the British would call the Blitz. By the time the sustained campaign ended in May 1941, more than 43,000 civilians had been killed across Britain, and over 1 million homes had been damaged or destroyed in London alone. But the numbers, as large as they are, don't really capture what those 57 nights felt like from the inside. Families descended into small Anderson shelters in their back gardens. Others went to brick shelters on street corners. And most famously, roughly 170,000 people sheltered every night in the underground stations, sleeping on platforms and in tunnels while the city above them shook. Children learned to identify German aircraft by the distinctive sound of their engines. Wardens patrolled every street in the dark. The government carefully monitored how people were holding up and found, repeatedly, that morale held not because Londoners were unafraid, but because fear, when it lasts long enough, gradually becomes something closer to habit. Something you carry with you, the way you carry keys. Just part of the weight of the day. Fact 2. Nobody who lived through the siege of Stalingrad ever fully left it. German and Finnish forces encircled the city in September 1941 and simply waited, cutting a city of roughly 3 million people off from food and supplies for what would become 872 days. In the worst period of that first terrible winter, the bread ration fell to 125 grams per day, a piece of bread roughly the size of a fist, for an entire day for every man, woman and child in the city. People burned furniture for warmth. They boiled leather for something resembling nourishment. They ate wallpaper paste. Approximately 1 million civilians died during the siege, most of them from starvation, a toll roughly 35 times higher than London's entire Blitz. And yet, the city did not surrender. Orchestras performed. The Hermitage Museum staff stayed to protect the collections. Schools operated when they could. The composer Shostakovich wrote his 7th symphony inside the siege, and it was performed by an orchestra so weakened by hunger that some musicians had to be carried to the concert hall on stretchers. The city endured because endurance, for Leningrad, was the only form of resistance that remained available, so they chose it every single day, for nearly 3 years. Fact 3. Warsaw holds a distinction that no city would ever want. It was the first European capital to be bombed in the Second World War, and it was also the most completely destroyed. German aircraft began bombing the city on September 1st, 1939, the very first day of the invasion of Poland, killing approximately 10,000 civilians in that initial campaign alone. But the bombing of 1939 was only the beginning. Warsaw endured German occupation from 1939 to 1944. The systematic destruction of its Jewish ghetto following the uprising of 1943. And then the near-total demolition of the rest of the city following the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. When the Polish Home Army finally surrendered after 63 days of fighting, Hitler ordered Warsaw razed. Specially trained German demolition units moved through the empty city with explosives, destroying block by block everything that the fighting had not already taken. By January 1945, when Soviet forces finally entered the city, approximately 85% of Warsaw's buildings had been destroyed. The soldiers who walked in did not find a damaged city. They found a field of rubble in which a city had once stood. The 1,000 civilians still living there were doing so in cellars beneath the ruins of everything they had ever known. Warsaw was not defeated, it was erased. And then it chose to rebuild. Fact 4. Most people have never heard of Chongqing, but between 1938 and 1943, it was one of the most heavily bombed cities on Earth. When Japanese forces advanced through eastern China, the Chinese government relocated its wartime capital to Chongqing, a city built into dramatic cliffs above two rivers in Sichuan province. Japan responded with a sustained bombing campaign, targeting not military facilities, but civilian morale. The explicit intention was to break the Chinese government's will to keep fighting by making daily life in the capital unbearable. The campaign ran for 5 years, killing tens of thousands of civilians. The city's residents responded by carving a network of tunnels and shelters directly into the limestone cliffs on which Chongqing was built, creating an entire underground city that could absorb much of the population during raids. In one of the most tragic single nights of the campaign, a tunnel shelter became so desperately overcrowded during a raid that thousands of people suffocated inside it. Estimates of the death toll from that single night range from 4,000 to 10,000 people. And yet, through all of it, through 5 full years of bombing, the Chinese government did not surrender. It did not negotiate. It did not move. The city absorbed everything that was thrown at it, season after season, and simply kept going. Fact 5. 316 square kilometers. That is the entire surface area of Malta, smaller than many cities. A tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean, with no room to retreat and nowhere to hide. And onto that small island, between 1940 and 1942, the Axis powers dropped approximately 14,000 tons of bombs in roughly 3,000 separate raids. A bomb load that exceeded the total dropped on London during the entire Blitz. Malta sat directly between Europe and North Africa, making it strategically essential to the Allies and urgently important to destroy for Germany and Italy. The island's civilian population of around 270,000 people simply could not leave. They sheltered in a network of tunnels carved into the island's soft limestone, emerging after raids to clear rubble, bury the dead, and wait quietly for the next one. Food supplies ran critically low as convoys were attacked. By the spring of 1942, Malta was surviving on minimal rations with fuel nearly exhausted. King George VI awarded the island the George Cross in April 1942. Addressed directly to the entire population, in formal acknowledgement that what the people of Malta were enduring was not merely civilian hardship. It was something that deserved to be recognized as a form of collective courage. Fact 6. In the space of 2 days, in late July 1943, the city of Hamburg was consumed by a fire that its own residents described as the end of the world. Operation Gomorrah was designed specifically to create a firestorm, and it succeeded beyond its planners' expectations. On the night of July 27th, incendiary bombs ignited fires across a densely built residential area all at once. And those fires merged and grew until they created their own weather system. A column of superheated air rising so fast that it pulled hurricane-force winds inward at ground level, feeding the flames with oxygen and making escape almost impossible for the people caught inside. Temperatures inside the firestorm reached around 800 degrees Celsius. Streets of asphalt melted. People who ran were sometimes pulled off their feet by the wind and drawn back toward the fire. Approximately 37,000 civilians died during Operation Gomorrah, most of them in those 2 days. Around 1 million survivors fled into the surrounding countryside in the days that followed, streaming out in a mass exodus that was almost impossible to manage or comprehend. Hamburg had been one of Germany's largest and most prosperous cities, a city of culture and commerce and ordinary family life. In 2 nights, it became a place that its own people could not live in. They came back eventually, but what they came back to was not what they had left. Fact 7. 6 weeks. That is how long the killing in Nanjing lasted after Japanese forces entered the city on December 13, 1937. What happened in those 6 weeks, documented by foreign witnesses who stayed in the city, by photographs, and by decades of historical research, is one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the entire war. Japanese soldiers killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers. The city's population had almost nowhere to go. A small group of foreign nationals, German businessmen, American missionaries, European doctors, established a safety zone in the city's western district and refused to leave, using their foreign status as a fragile but real shield to protect the Chinese civilians who flooded into the zone seeking refuge. At its peak, approximately 200,000 people were sheltering in a safety zone, entirely dependent on the willingness of a handful of foreigners to stand between them and the soldiers outside. The zone held, imperfectly and at enormous personal risk. The city around it did not. When the killing finally stopped and some kind of order was restored, what remained in Nanjing was a city that had been psychologically destroyed, even where it had been physically spared. A place where the streets looked familiar, but everything familiar had been taken. Fact 8. Shortly after midnight, on March 10th, 1945, the people of Tokyo, who were still awake, heard the engines first. 334 American bombers approached the city from the east, flying low. Each one loaded not with high explosives, but with incendiary bombs, designed specifically to ignite the densely packed wooden residential neighborhoods that covered most of the city. Within hours, a firestorm had consumed 16 square miles. The canals that residents tried to use as escape routes filled with people and caught fire as the surface oil ignited. Between 80,000 and 100,000 civilians died in a single night. More than died immediately in either of the atomic bombings that followed. Approximately 1 million people were left homeless by morning. The operation was a deliberate shift in American bombing strategy, from targeting factories and industrial facilities to burning the residential neighborhoods where the workers who ran those factories lived. The general who planned it, Curtis LeMay, said afterward that if the United States had lost the war, he would have expected to be tried as a war criminal. That statement is, in its own way, one of the most honest things any military commander said about what strategic bombing actually was. The people of Tokyo who survived that night did not need a trial to understand what had happened to them. Fact 9. 500,000 civilians were still inside Stalingrad when the Germans arrived in the summer of 1942. The Soviet authorities had delayed evacuation, partly from reluctance to signal that the city might fall, partly because Stalin himself believed the presence of civilians would motivate the defenders to fight harder. What followed was the most destructive urban battle in human history, fought street by street, floor by floor, room by room, across a city that bombing had already reduced largely to rubble before the ground fighting even began. Civilians who had not escaped lived in cellars and sewers, emerging to find food when they could, caught between two armies with no safe direction to move in any direction. The city's name, Stalin's City, made surrender ideologically impossible for the Soviet side, which meant every civilian still inside was trapped inside a battle that neither side could afford to lose. By February 1943, when the German Sixth Army finally surrendered, 99% of the city's buildings had been destroyed. Soviet authorities counted 1,515 civilians still alive in the ruins. The pre-war population had been somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000. The gap between those two numbers represents one of the most complete destructions of a civilian population in the history of warfare. Fact 11. Rotterdam did not have days to prepare. It had an ultimatum and a deadline, and when the deadline passed, the bombs came anyway. On May 14, 1940, German forces issued an ultimatum to the Dutch defenders: surrender or the city would be bombed. Negotiations were still technically ongoing when the Luftwaffe arrived. German ground commanders tried to call off the raid by firing red signal flares, the abort signal, but only part of the bomber formation saw them. The rest dropped their loads on the city center as planned. In approximately 90 minutes, the heart of Rotterdam was destroyed. Around 1,150 civilians were killed, 85,000 were made homeless, and 2.5 square kilometers of the city center burned to the ground. The Netherlands surrendered the following day, citing the destruction of Rotterdam and the threat of the same fate for Amsterdam and Utrecht. A single 90-minute raid had ended a country's resistance. What made it worse, in a specific and lasting way, was the knowledge that it had almost been stopped, that the flares had gone up, that some pilots had turned back, and that the ones who hadn't had simply not seen the signal in time. Rotterdam was not destroyed by strategy. It was destroyed by a communication failure measured in seconds. Fact 12. By the time the war ended, Berlin had been bombed 363 times. The city that had been the showcase of Nazi power, its wide boulevards and monumental architecture, was by 1945 a landscape of burned-out shells and rubble mountains that Berliners called Trümmerböcke, meaning rubble hills. Approximately 2 million of Berlin's pre-war population of 4 million had been evacuated or fled by the time Soviet forces reached the city in April 1945. Those who remained, mainly women, elderly people and children, had spent months living in cellars and bunkers, emerging to find food and water in a city whose infrastructure had largely collapsed. The Soviet assault in April and May 1945 added ground combat to aerial bombardment, turning the remaining streets into a battlefield. Approximately 125,000 civilians died during the Battle of Berlin. The city that emerged from the rubble was then divided between 4 occupation powers, and the division that followed, eventually producing the Berlin Wall in 1961, meant that the city's people endured a different but no less constraining form of confinement for another 4 decades after the bombs had stopped. Berlin was bombed, then fought over, then divided, then walled. The city endured so many layers of what war does to a place that its story took 50 years to reach anything resembling ordinary life. Fact 13. Imagine inheriting a city, not through wealth or politics, but through survival. Simply walking into a place where everyone else has been killed or driven out, and finding that the institution you love is still standing because you stayed to protect it. That is roughly what happened in Leningrad's cultural institutions during the siege. The staff of the Hermitage Museum remained inside the besieged city throughout all 872 days, living in the museum's basement after the collections had been evacuated east. They maintained the building, they kept records, they preserved the institution itself through sheer physical presence, because someone had decided that staying was the right thing to do. Libraries stayed open, schools operated, and on August 9, 1942, the Leningrad Philharmonic performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, broadcast live on radio and through loudspeakers aimed toward the German lines. The musicians were so weakened by hunger that several had to be carried to the hall on stretchers. The conductor had lost so many players to starvation and combat that he had to recruit surviving musicians from military units and civil defense organizations. The performance lasted 80 minutes. The Leningrad residents who heard it described it not as a concert but as a statement, a direct, quiet, public insistence that the city was still alive, still making something beautiful, still not finished. Fact 14. Singapore fell on February 15, 1942, and the approximately 1 million civilians living in the city at the time of the surrender had no say in what came next. The British had promoted Singapore as an impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of the East, and had built its coastal defenses accordingly, with enormous guns pointing out to sea. The Japanese came overland through the Malayan jungle instead, and the guns were pointed at the wrong ocean. When the British general surrendered in the Ford Motor Factory on the city's outskirts, the civilian population of Singapore became subject to Japanese occupation almost overnight. What followed in the immediate aftermath was a series of systematic massacres of Chinese civilians suspected of being anti-Japanese. Estimates of the death toll range from 25,000 to 50,000 people killed in the weeks after the surrender. For the broader civilian population, the occupation that followed lasted 3.5 years, during which food was rationed, movement was restricted, and the specific daily weight of living under a military administration that held civilian life cheaply became the defining texture of existence. The city did not recover anything resembling stable civilian life until the Japanese surrender in August 1945. The fortress that had been built to be impregnable had fallen in 7 days, and the people inside it paid for those 7 days with 3.5 years. Fact 15. Athens starved. That is the simplest and most accurate way to describe what happened to the Greek capital between 1941 and 1942. And the simplicity of the statement should not be allowed to soften what it actually means. When Axis forces occupied Greece in April 1941, the occupying powers requisitioned food supplies for their own military needs while a naval blockade prevented imports from reaching the country. The result was a famine that killed between 100,000 and 300,000 Greek civilians, with the highest death rates in Athens. At the peak of the famine in the winter of 1941 to 1942, the city's streets filled with people dying in public, collapsing on pavements, lying in doorways, children with the visible signs of severe malnutrition begging outside shops that had nothing left to sell. The city's death rate rose to approximately 10 times its peacetime level during the worst months. International pressure eventually led to some relief convoys, and the situation slowly improved in 1942, but the damage had already been done. The Athenians who survived that winter did so through a combination of extraordinary community solidarity and the absolute abandonment of the ordinary rules of daily life, a spectrum of human behavior under extreme pressure that the city's post-war memory processed slowly, incompletely, and with the particular difficulty of things that feel too hard to look at directly. Fact 16. Occupied Paris wore its fear quietly. There were no sustained bombing campaigns targeting the French capital. The Germans wanted Paris intact, as a showcase and as a symbol, but the fear that settled over the city after June 1940 was no less real for being invisible from the air. It was a quieter, more personal, more corrosive kind of fear. The fear of a knock on the door at night, the fear of an identity check on the street corner, the fear of a neighbor who might report you. Food rations for an adult amounted to 350 grams of bread per day, 50 grams of cheese, 300 grams of meat per week, and 500 grams of sugar per month. Black markets flourished because the official rations were simply not enough to live on, and participating in the black market was simultaneously an act of illegal survival and a small daily defiance. Jewish Parisians lived under a separate and more acute terror, required to wear yellow stars from 1942, excluded from public life by escalating restrictions. And then on July 16th and 17th, 1942, French police arrested over 13,000 Jewish men, women and children and held them in a sports stadium before deportation. There were no German soldiers involved. Paris did that to its own residents. That is the fact that has taken Paris the longest to look at honestly, and the one that the city has spent the most decades trying to understand. Fact 17. Kyiv fell to German forces in September 1941, after a battle that cost the Soviet Union approximately 600,000 soldiers killed or captured, one of the largest military encirclements in history. The civilians who remained as German forces entered had survived the battle only to find themselves at the beginning of something worse. Within days of occupation, the German military administration began organizing the systematic murder of the city's Jewish population. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, at a ravine on the city's outskirts called Babi Yar, German forces and Ukrainian auxiliary police shot 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children in 2 days, one of the largest single mass killings of the entire Holocaust. The remaining civilian population of Kyiv then lived under an occupation that was brutal even by the standards of German-occupied Soviet territory. Forced labor, reprisal executions, food confiscation, and the systematic looting of the city's cultural resources defined life there for 2 years. By the time Soviet forces liberated the city in November 1943, approximately 195,000 of Kyiv's pre-war population of 930,000 had been killed. The city had survived. A very large part of what had made it the city it was had not. Fact 18. Caen was supposed to be liberated in hours. The Allied plan for D-Day, June 6, 1944, called for British and Canadian forces to capture the Norman city on the first day of the invasion. It took nearly 2 months. The German defense was stronger and the Allied advance slower than anyone had planned for, and Caen became the focal point of a grinding attritional battle that turned the city into rubble long before it was ever liberated. Allied bombing intended to support the ground advance struck the city repeatedly, killing approximately 2,000 civilians and destroying around 3/4 of its buildings. And yet, remarkably, the ancient Abbaye aux Somme, a church built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, sheltered approximately 2,000 civilians throughout the entire battle, and not a single one of those 2,000 people was killed. Its thick Norman stone absorbed damage that would have killed people in lighter structures. Red Cross flags flew from the building and were somehow, against all odds, respected by both sides. When British forces finally entered Caen on July 9th, they found a city effectively destroyed in the process of being saved. Its streets were impassable under rubble. Its medieval center was gone. The liberation of Caen was real, so was the price. Both things were true at exactly the same time. Fact 19. Amsterdam's fear was different from the fear of bombed cities because it came not from the sky but from the street, from the uniforms moving through familiar neighborhoods, from the administrative lists being compiled by people who knew exactly where everyone lived, from the precision with which a city's Jewish population was identified, isolated, and removed. The Netherlands had one of the highest Jewish deportation rates in Western Europe. Approximately 75% of the country's 140,000 Jewish citizens were killed during the occupation. Amsterdam's Jewish quarter, which had existed for centuries, was systematically emptied between 1942 and 1943. For the broader non-Jewish population, the occupation meant forced labor, food shortages, and the random violence of a military administration that could punish collective resistance with collective reprisal. The hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, which killed approximately 20,000 civilians in the occupied Western Netherlands, added starvation to occupation. Amsterdammers survived on tulip bulbs and sugar beets, burning furniture for warmth in a city that had once been one of the most prosperous in Europe. Liberation came on May 5, 1945. The city that was liberated bore almost no resemblance to the city that had been occupied 5 years earlier. Not in its buildings, which were largely intact, but in its people. What had been done between the people was what took the longest to rebuild. Fact 20. Minsk was occupied by German forces on June 28, 1941, just 6 days after the start of the invasion. The speed of the German advance meant that evacuation was incomplete, leaving a large civilian population under occupation before anyone had fully processed that the war had reached them. The Germans established a ghetto for Minsk's Jewish population, approximately 80,000 people at its peak, including Jews deported from Western Europe, and conducted mass killings in the surrounding forests that eliminated the ghetto's population in waves between 1941 and 1943. For the broader civilian population, the 3-year occupation was defined by forced labor, mass reprisal killings in response to partisan activity, and the systematic stripping of the city's material and cultural resources. When Soviet forces liberated Minsk on July 3, 1944, approximately 80% of the city's buildings had been destroyed, one of the highest destruction rates of any European city. The pre-war population of approximately 300,000 had been reduced to around 50,000. The city that Soviet soldiers entered was barely recognizable as a city at all. It was a landscape of ruins punctuated by isolated surviving structures, inhabited by a population that had endured 3 years of conditions that had no equivalent in the Western European experience of occupation, and that had endured them largely in silence because there was no one to tell. Fact 21. Cologne became the first city in history to be attacked by 1,000 bombers in a single night. On the night of May 30th to 31st, 1942, RAF Bomber Command assembled every available aircraft, operational bombers, training aircraft, anything that could fly and carry a bomb load, and sent them all to Cologne at once. The raid destroyed approximately 600 acres of the city, killed around 470 civilians, and made approximately 45,000 people homeless. Compared to what would come later, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, the immediate casualties were relatively contained, but the psychological impact on Germany and the political impact within Britain were significant. The raid demonstrated that the Allied air war could operate at a scale that had never been seen before. For the people of Cologne who lived through it, the meaning was simpler and more immediate. Their city had been struck by 1,000 aircraft in a single night, and the war that had previously felt distant had arrived, in overwhelming and undeniable force directly overhead. They had heard the engines fill the sky. They had seen what 1,000 aircraft could do to a city in a matter of hours, and they understood, in the way that only direct experience teaches, that what had happened to cities elsewhere was now happening to them, and that the nights ahead would not be like the nights before. Fact 22. The island of Malta and the city of Valletta share something with very few other places in the world. They were awarded a military decoration. The George Cross, Britain's highest civilian honor, was presented to Malta collectively by King George VI in April 1942, in a letter addressed to the island's governor that began with the words, "To honor her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta." The decoration was given because what Malta had endured by that point, nearly 2 years of sustained bombing, critical food and fuel shortages, and the near-constant presence of death from the air, had gone beyond what any conventional framework for civilian endurance could adequately describe. Valletta, the capital, had been struck repeatedly, its beautiful Baroque architecture pocked and shattered by bomb damage, its streets cleared and re-cleared of rubble by civilian teams working between raids. The Grand Harbour had become one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world, with supply convoys attacked as they attempted to reach the island. The George Cross did not end the bombing or solve the food shortage. What it did was acknowledge, formally and publicly, that what the people of Malta were doing, simply continuing to exist and function under those conditions, was not ordinary. It was not ordinary at all, and they deserved to be told so. Fact 23. Dresden had been called the Florence of the Elbe. It was one of Germany's most beautiful cities, a Baroque masterpiece of churches, palaces and art galleries that had remained largely undamaged through 5 years of war. By February 1945, it was also crowded with refugees, hundreds of thousands of people who had fled the Soviet advance from the east. On the nights of February 13th and 14th, British and American bombers struck Dresden in 4 waves, dropping approximately 3,900 tons of bombs. A firestorm consumed the city center. Approximately 25,000 people were killed, a figure established by an independent historical commission, significantly lower than earlier estimates but still 25,000 individual people, dead in 2 nights. The debate over Dresden, whether it was a legitimate military target, whether the bombing was proportionate given the stage of the war, whether it constituted something that the world needed to name and reckon with, began almost immediately and has never entirely stopped. What is certain is that the Florence of the Elbe was gone. What replaced it was a question about the limits of what war is permitted to do that no subsequent answer has ever fully resolved. The city was rebuilt. The question remained open. In some ways it still is. Fact 24. Belgrade was bombed on a Sunday morning, and the date was not accidental. April 6, 1941, was Orthodox Easter Sunday, a day when the city's Serbian population would be in church or at home with their families, when the streets would be full of people in their best clothes, when the psychological impact of sudden bombardment would be maximized by the contrast with the morning's specific quality of peace and celebration. Operation Retribution was Hitler's personal response to a Yugoslav coup that had overturned a government that had agreed to join the Axis. The bombing killed between 2,000 and 4,000 civilians on that first day alone, striking the city center, the Royal Palace, the National Library, and residential neighborhoods simultaneously. Yugoslavia had not yet formally entered the war. Its government had not had time to organize civilian defense or evacuation. The people of Belgrade who died on that Easter morning died in a city that had been at peace the day before, killed by a decision made in Berlin as a demonstration of what happened to countries that changed their minds. The message was received very clearly by everyone who heard it. It was also, as it turned out, the beginning of a Yugoslav resistance that would tie down significant Axis forces for the entire rest of the war. Fact 25. Budapest endured one of the longest urban sieges of the European war, and the civilians caught inside it paid a price that rarely appears in standard accounts of the conflict's final months. Soviet forces encircled the Hungarian capital in late October 1944, and the siege that followed lasted until February 13, 1945. Approximately 100 days during which the city's civilian population was trapped between Soviet forces outside and German and Hungarian forces defending from within. Approximately 38,000 civilians died during the siege, killed by artillery, bombardment, starvation, cold, and the specific violence that urban combat produces when it moves through residential streets. The city's Jewish population faced the additional threat of Arrow Cross militia death squads that continued operating inside the siege perimeter, shooting Jewish people into the Danube even as the city collapsed around them. Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, working from Budapest during the siege, issued protective passports to tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews, an act of individual courage estimated to have saved between 10,000 and 100,000 lives depending on how the saving is counted. Wallenberg was arrested by Soviet forces after the siege ended and disappeared into the Soviet prison system, never returning home. He had saved an enormous number of lives and paid for it with his own freedom, in a story that has no satisfying resolution. Fact 26. Sevastopol was built to be defended. The city on the southern tip of Crimea had been a fortified naval base since the 18th century, and its defenders in 1941 and 1942 used every advantage the geography and the fortifications gave them to hold out against a German assault that most military analysts had expected to last weeks. It lasted 250 days, from October 1941 to July 1942. Soviet forces and the city's civilian population endured one of the most sustained sieges of the entire Eastern Front, living in a network of caves and tunnels carved into the limestone cliffs above the Black Sea. The cave system became an underground city. Hospitals, schools, munitions factories, and living quarters all relocated beneath the surface, where the German artillery that pounded everything above ground could not reach them. Civilians worked alongside soldiers, manufacturing ammunition, treating the wounded, maintaining the infrastructure of a city that was fighting for its existence on every street simultaneously. When the city finally fell in July 1942, after German forces deployed some of the largest artillery pieces ever built, the surviving population was evacuated by sea under fire. The city that had held for 250 days was gone, but the people who had lived inside it carried it with them in the specific and unlosable way of people who have survived something together that had no equivalent anywhere else. Fact 27. Liverpool did not receive as much attention as London during the Blitz, but the people of Liverpool would have found that observation darkly amusing given what they lived through. Britain's most important Atlantic port was a priority target for the Luftwaffe from the beginning, and the raids that struck the city between 1940 and 1942 killed over 4,000 civilians and destroyed approximately 10,000 homes. The May Blitz of 1941, 7 consecutive nights of bombing between May 1st and May 7th, was one of the most concentrated provincial bombing campaigns of the entire war, killing approximately 1,900 people in a single week and leaving 70,000 Liverpudlians homeless. The city's docks, essential to the Atlantic convoys bringing food and supplies from North America, were the primary target. But the docks and the residential neighborhoods surrounding them were the same place. The people who worked the docks lived within walking distance of them, and the bombs that targeted the port infrastructure fell equally on the houses beside it. Liverpool endured its bombing with the practical resilience and dark humor that characterized the city's response to most adversities, but the scale of what it absorbed between 1940 and 1942 has never been fully reflected in the national memory of the Blitz. Liverpool was doing what London was doing, at roughly the same scale, at roughly the same time. It just didn't make it into as many of the official photographs. Fact 28. Shanghai in 1937 was a city of extraordinary complexity, divided between Chinese districts and foreign concessions, home to one of the largest expatriate communities in Asia, one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world. On August 14, 1937, Chinese nationalist aircraft attempting to bomb Japanese warships in the river instead dropped their bombs on the crowded streets of the international settlement on a Saturday afternoon. Approximately 2,000 civilians were killed in that single afternoon, one of the deadliest single incidents of civilian casualties in the entire Sino-Japanese War. The city that followed, under Japanese occupation from 1937 for the Chinese districts, and from December 1941 for the foreign concessions following Pearl Harbor, became a place defined by walls within walls. Zones of relative safety sat directly adjacent to zones of extreme danger. The foreign residents who had treated Shanghai as a place of opportunity and excitement found themselves, after December 1941, in internment camps on the outskirts of the city they had treated as their own, the city that had seemed to operate by its own special rules, a place where the normal constraints of nationality and politics seemed somehow to not quite apply, discovered that those rules had always been provisional, and that when the moment came, the normal constraints applied there exactly as they applied everywhere else. Fact 29. Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945, was a city of approximately 350,000 people going about the beginning of an ordinary working day. The air raid warning that had sounded earlier for a weather reconnaissance aircraft had been cancelled. People were moving through the streets, arriving at offices, preparing for school. At 8:15 in the morning, a single atomic bomb detonated approximately 600 meters above the city center. The fireball reached temperatures of several million degrees. The blast wave traveled outward at roughly the speed of sound. Within seconds, approximately 70,000 people were dead. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to between 90,000 and 140,000 as people who had survived the initial blast died from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. Approximately 5 square miles of the city were destroyed almost instantaneously. Survivors described the landscape immediately after the blast as a flat, silent plain of ash and rubble in which nothing recognizable remained standing. People moved through it in shock, badly burned, looking for family members in a place where the landmarks that would have guided them no longer existed. Hiroshima was not the most destructive single bombing of the war in terms of immediate casualties. The Tokyo firebombing had killed more in a single night. What made it different was that it was done by one plane, with one bomb, in one instant. Fact 30. Nagasaki was not the original target. On August 9, 1945, the B-29 carrying the second atomic bomb was directed first toward Kokura, a city on the northern coast of Kyushu that housed a major arsenal. Kokura was covered by cloud and smoke, and the bombardier could not achieve the visual confirmation required for release. After 3 passes over the city, With fuel running low and Japanese fighters beginning to respond, the crew turned toward the secondary target, Nagasaki. Cloud cover there was also heavy, but a break appeared at the last moment. The bomb was released at 11:02 in the morning, detonating approximately 500 meters above the city's Urakami district. The geography of Nagasaki, a valley surrounded by hills, contained some of the blast, limiting the destruction compared to Hiroshima. Approximately 40,000 people died immediately, with the total rising to between 60,000 and 80,000 by the end of 1945. The Urakami Cathedral, one of the largest Catholic churches in Asia and the center of Nagasaki's Christian community, was less than 500 meters from the explosion and was completely destroyed. The people of Kokura, who had been the intended target and were spared by cloud cover and smoke, have referred to their city's escape ever since with a Japanese phrase that translates roughly as Kokura's luck. Sometimes history turns on the weather. Fact 31. Warsaw's second destruction, the one that came after the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, was not a military necessity, it was a punishment. When the Polish Home Army rose against the German occupation on August 1, 1944, the uprising was intended to liberate the city before Soviet forces arrived. The Soviets halted their advance on the eastern bank of the river and did not cross to assist. The German response was overwhelming. SS units conducted mass executions of civilians in the first days, killing approximately 40,000 people in a single district alone in what became known as the Wola massacre. The fighting lasted 63 days. When the Home Army finally surrendered, the Germans evacuated the remaining civilian population and then, on Hitler's personal order, began the systematic demolition of whatever remained standing. Trained demolition units moved through the empty city for months, blowing up block after block with engineering precision. It was not bombing, it was deliberate, methodical erasure. A city being unmade by design, building by building, until there was almost nothing left. When Soviet forces finally entered in January 1945, they walked into a field of rubble in which a city had once stood. The demolition units had done their work almost perfectly, because they had not destroyed the idea of Warsaw. That had survived everything. Fact 32. Stalingrad's factory district never stopped producing tanks while the battle raged around it. Workers continued operating the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory and other industrial plants even as German forces fought to capture them, producing T-34 tanks that were driven directly from the factory floor onto the battlefield, sometimes less than a kilometer away. Workers who were not producing weapons were fighting alongside soldiers in the ruins of their own workplace, defending machinery they had operated in peacetime with weapons they had barely been trained to use. The specific geography of the factory district, massive industrial buildings of reinforced concrete and steel, made it one of the most bitterly contested sectors of the entire battle. German forces captured parts of the factories repeatedly, only to be driven out by Soviet counterattacks moving through the same destroyed rooms and corridors at night. The workers who kept the factories running were not soldiers and received no military training or protection. They worked, fought, and died in the same place, often on the same day, because the distinction between worker and defender had become, in Stalingrad's factory district, entirely meaningless. They had chosen to stay, not because they had no fear, but because staying felt like the only answer to what was happening around them. Fact 33. Nanjing's safety zone was maintained by 22 foreigners who refused to leave. When Japanese forces approached the city in December 1937, most foreign nationals evacuated. The 22 who stayed formed a committee and established a protected area in the western part of the city where Chinese civilians could seek refuge. The committee's chairman was John Raab, a German businessman and Nazi Party member, whose German nationality gave him a degree of protection with the Japanese military that he used consistently and courageously on behalf of the Chinese civilians in his care. Raab personally intervened hundreds of times to stop individual acts of violence, placing himself physically between Japanese soldiers and Chinese civilians, using his Nazi Party armband as a shield in one of the war's stranger ironies of moral agency. The safety zone at its peak sheltered approximately 200,000 people in an area of roughly 4 square kilometers. The committee had no military force, no legal authority that the Japanese military was obligated to respect, and no guarantee that their presence would protect anyone. What they had was physical presence and the willingness to keep showing up, writing letters, documenting what they witnessed, feeding the people in their care, in conditions where most of what they were doing felt inadequate to the scale of what was happening outside. The zone held. The city around it did not. But 200,000 people survived because 22 people refused to go home. Fact 34. Malta's tunnel network was not built for the war. It had existed for centuries, carved into the soft limestone that underlies the entire island. But the war transformed it from a historical feature into a survival system. As the Axis bombing campaign intensified in 1941 and 1942, the Maltese expanded the existing tunnels significantly, creating shelters capable of housing large numbers of people during raids. The tunnels were not comfortable. They were dark, damp, cold in winter and airless in summer, and the sound of bombs detonating above ground traveled through the rock with enough force to shake loose dust and small stones from the ceiling. Families brought whatever they could carry, blankets, food, a few precious objects, and lived in them for hours at a time, sometimes longer when raids came in consecutive waves. Children were born in the tunnels during particularly sustained periods of bombing. Entire communities relocated their social life underground, with neighbors who had lived on the same street for decades now sharing a tunnel shelf instead of a garden wall. The limestone that formed the tunnels also formed the walls of Valletta's Baroque buildings, and when those buildings were struck by bombs, the rubble they produced was the same soft stone, which meant that in some cases, people buried by a collapsed building could be dug out alive more quickly than they would have been in a city built from harder materials. Malta's geology had shaped its architecture for centuries. It also, in those years, shaped its survival. Fact 35. The city of Chongqing developed a particular relationship with the Yangtze River fog during the years of Japanese bombing. The fog that settled over the city during winter months made aerial navigation difficult and provided a natural protection that the city's residents came to rely on with something approaching superstition. During the foggy months, the raids stopped or became infrequent, and the population used those months to rebuild, restock, and recover. When the fog lifted in spring, the raids resumed, and the cycle began again. The Japanese bombing campaign against Chongqing was the longest sustained strategic campaign against a single city before the Allied campaigns against Germany. It ran for 5 years, and the city absorbed raids of varying intensity and rebuilt itself between them with a persistence that confounded Japanese expectations. The campaign failed completely in its primary objective. The nationalist government did not surrender, did not relocate, and did not collapse under the pressure of what was being done to it. What the campaign produced instead was a city that had learned to live with bombing as a seasonal condition, not normalized in the sense of acceptable, but incorporated into the rhythms of a daily life that refused to organize itself entirely around the threat. The fog came in winter, the plains came in spring, and the city kept going. Fact 36. Rotterdam's post-war rebuilding became one of the most significant urban planning experiments of the 20th century, largely because the destruction had been so complete that the city had almost no choice but to begin from scratch. Where other bombed European cities rebuilt along their original street plans, fitting new buildings into the footprints of the old ones, Rotterdam's planners took the opportunity of total destruction to reimagine the city entirely. Wide boulevards replaced narrow medieval streets. Modern architecture replaced traditional Dutch townhouses. The city center that emerged from the post-war rebuilding was radically different from what had been destroyed, more functional, more modern, deliberately designed around the needs of a city moving into the second half of the 20th century. This reimagining was not without loss. The intimacy and texture of the old city were gone, but it was also a genuine act of civic renewal, a refusal to simply replicate what had been destroyed, and an insistence that a city bombed into nothing could become something new, rather than merely something rebuilt. Rotterdam today is still one of the most architecturally modern city centers in Europe. Its appearance, the wide streets, the bold buildings, the open spaces, is the direct consequence of 90 minutes of bombing in May 1940. The city was made blank by destruction and then chose, very deliberately, what to write on that blank space. Fact 37. Vienna was bombed 52 times before Soviet ground forces arrived in April 1945. Austria's capital had been incorporated into the Third Reich in 1938, and its Jewish population, approximately 185,000 people, the largest Jewish community in the German-speaking world, had been subjected to immediate violent persecution following the annexation. By 1942, the vast majority had been deported. The city that Allied bombers began targeting in 1943 was already a different city, depleted, frightened, governed by an administration that had been imposed rather than elected. The bombing targeted oil refineries and railway infrastructure, but residential areas were also struck repeatedly, killing approximately 37,000 Viennese civilians over the course of the campaign. The Vienna State Opera, one of the most celebrated opera houses in the world, was destroyed by bombing in March 1945. The Burgtheater was heavily damaged. The Great Cathedral was struck in April 1945, in the final days before Soviet forces entered the city. Vienna's post-war cultural recovery, the rebuilding of the opera, the restoration of the great institutions, was partly practical and partly a deliberate act of identity reconstruction. A city insisting on being recognizable to itself after years of being remade by others, one carefully restored building at a time. Fact 38. The people of Coventry rebuilt their bombed cathedral, and then deliberately left the ruins standing. The decision to preserve the shell of the medieval St. Michael's Cathedral, its walls and spire intact, its interior open to the sky, while building a new cathedral directly beside it, was not a practical compromise. It was a philosophical statement. The architect who won the competition to design the new building insisted from the beginning that the old ruin and the new cathedral should function as a single ensemble. Entering the new building required walking through the ruins of the old one, past the charred cross made from two burned roof beams found in the rubble on the morning after the raid, past the altar of remembrance built into the ruins themselves. The new cathedral was consecrated in 1962, and its dedication was explicitly framed around reconciliation rather than victory. The cross of nails made from 3 medieval nails found in the ruins became the symbol of an international reconciliation ministry that sent replicas to churches in Dresden, Berlin, and Hiroshima. Coventry's response to its own destruction was to make the destruction itself into a statement about something larger than destruction, a refusal to let what had been done to the city be the final word about what the city was. The ruins and the new walls stand together still, exactly as intended, both telling the same story from different ends. Fact 39. Leningrad's children grew up inside the siege. Children who were 5 or 6 when the blockade began in September 1941, were 8 or 9 when it was finally broken in January 1944. Their entire conscious memory of childhood was formed inside the conditions of the siege, the cold, the hunger, the specific acoustics of artillery fire and aircraft engines overhead, the routines organized around survival rather than school and play. Schools continued to operate inside the city during the siege because the Soviet authorities understood that maintaining educational routine was a form of psychological resistance as well as a practical necessity. Children attended classes in unheated buildings, wearing their coats and gloves, in conditions where the teacher might be visibly weakened by hunger and the lesson might be interrupted by artillery fire. Diaries kept by Leningrad children during the siege were collected after the war, and they constitute one of the most direct and heartbreaking records of what the siege felt like from the inside. One of the most famous, the diary of 11-year-old Lena Mikoina, records the progressive deterioration of daily life with a child's specific attention to food, cold, and the disappearance of people she knew, written in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has no framework to understand that what she is experiencing is extraordinary, because it was all she had ever known. Fact 40. Manila in February 1945 was the site of one of the most destructive urban battles of the Pacific War, and the civilians caught inside it, died in numbers that have never received the attention they deserve outside the Philippines. The battle between American forces and the Japanese garrison lasted from February 3rd to March 3rd, 1945, and approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed during those 4 weeks. Some deliberately murdered by Japanese forces in organized massacres, others killed by American artillery fire used to destroy Japanese positions in residential neighborhoods. Manila had been one of the most beautiful cities in Asia before the war, a Spanish colonial city of churches, palaces, and wide promenades overlaid with American-era civic architecture. When the battle ended, approximately 80% of the residential areas and 100% of the business district had been destroyed. It was, after Warsaw, the second most completely destroyed Allied capital of the entire war. The cultural and architectural heritage that was destroyed in 4 weeks of fighting in 1945 had taken 4 centuries to accumulate. The speed of its destruction relative to the time it had taken to build is one of the measures of what urban warfare in the 20th century was capable of doing to everything that a city had taken generations to become. Fact 41. The Greek city of Thessaloniki lost 96% of its Jewish population to deportation. The city had been home to one of the oldest and most significant Sephardic Jewish communities in the world, descendants of Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, who had built a community that at its peak constituted the majority of the city's population. By the 20th century, Thessaloniki's Jewish community of approximately 50,000 people was deeply woven into the city's commercial, cultural, and social fabric. The port closed on the Jewish Sabbath because so many of the dock workers were Jewish. German occupation began in April 1941, and the process of persecution was systematic from the start. In March 1943, deportations to Auschwitz began, and within 5 months approximately 46,000 Thessalonian Jews had been transported to the camp, where the vast majority were killed immediately on arrival. The community that had existed for 450 years was effectively destroyed in 5 months. The city that remained was materially intact but socially hollowed, a place where entire neighborhoods had been emptied, where the Ladino language that had been heard on the streets for centuries was suddenly silent, where the absence of tens of thousands of people was a presence in itself, felt in every empty shop, every abandoned house, every name that was no longer called across a square that still looked exactly the same. Fact 42. Guernica was not a major city. It was a small Basque market town of approximately 7,000 people, with no significant military presence and no strategic industrial value. What it had was symbolic importance. The ancient spiritual capital of the Basque people, the site of the oak tree under which Spanish kings had historically sworn to respect Basque rights. On April 26, 1937, during the Spanish Civil War, technically a separate conflict, but one in which Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy were actively testing weapons and tactics they would use in the World War to come, German aircraft bombed Guernica for approximately 3 hours on a Monday afternoon, which was market day, when the town was at its most crowded. Between 150 and 1,600 civilians were killed. The death toll remains disputed, and approximately 70% of the buildings were destroyed. Pablo Picasso, working in Paris, heard the news and painted his response in 6 weeks. Guernica, the painting, became the most famous anti-war artwork of the 20th century. Guernica, the town, was rebuilt, but what had happened to it became a reference point that preceded the Second World War and informed how the world understood what aerial bombardment of civilians meant before the far larger campaigns of 1939 to 1945 had even begun. It was, in retrospect, the warning. Not everyone heard it. Fact 43. The city of Stalingrad had a population of somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 people before the battle. When Soviet forces retook it in February 1943, they found 1,515 civilians still alive in the ruins. That number, 1,515, is one of the starkest single statistics of the entire war, because it represents not a death toll, but a survival count. And the gap between the population that had been there and the population that was found is a measure of destruction that no single figure for the dead can quite convey. The 1,515 who remained had survived in cellars, in tunnels, in whatever spaces the fighting had not yet reached. They had survived the German bombing that preceded the ground battle, 5 months of urban combat, the Soviet winter counteroffensive, and the final German collapse. They were found by Soviet soldiers who were themselves in a condition of extreme exhaustion after months of fighting. The images produced by Soviet photographers in the days after liberation, people emerging from rubble into a landscape that bore no resemblance to the city they had known, became some of the defining visual documents of the entire Eastern Front. What they show is not triumph, they show endurance. The specific, quiet, almost unbelievable endurance of people who had simply refused to stop. Fact 44. Prague was one of the very few major European capitals to survive the war largely intact, and the reason was a combination of strategic calculation, geographical fortune, and the specific circumstances of its liberation. The German occupation of Czechoslovakia began in March 1939, and the city spent 6 years under an administration that deported and murdered its Jewish population, suppressed its cultural life, and systematically subordinated its Czech identity to German control. But the city's buildings were not bombed by either side in the way that Warsaw or Rotterdam or Dresden were bombed, partly because the Allies had no strategic reason to destroy Czech infrastructure, and partly because the Germans had no reason to destroy a city they were occupying and using. When the Prague Uprising began on May 5, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, the city came closer to destruction than at any previous point. But Soviet forces arrived on May 9th, and the fighting stopped. Prague emerged from 6 years of occupation with its architecture intact and its population reduced, its freedom restored, and its collaborations unresolved. A city that had survived by being useful to its occupiers rather than by resisting them, and that spent the post-war decades negotiating the complicated meaning of that particular form of survival. Fact 45. Rangoon fell to Japanese forces in March 1942 after a chaotic and deeply inadequate evacuation that was devastating for the civilians who could not get out in time. The city had been home to a diverse population of approximately 500,000 people. Burmese, Indian, Chinese, British, and a range of other communities accumulated in one of Southeast Asia's most important ports. When it became clear that British forces could not hold the city, the colonial administration organized an evacuation that prioritized European civilians and military personnel, and left the majority of the city's Indian population, approximately 500,000 people, many of them poor laborers with no resources for independent flight, to make their own way northward on foot. The overland journey to India across Burmese jungle in monsoon conditions killed tens of thousands of people from exhaustion, starvation, and disease. Those who remained in Rangoon under Japanese occupation faced 3 years of a military administration that used forced labor extensively and provided minimal care to the civilian population. The specific inequity of the Rangoon evacuation, the tiered system of who was helped to leave and who was left to walk, was acknowledged after the war as one of the clearest examples of the colonial system's fundamental calculation about whose lives mattered more. The colonial system had a hierarchy. The evacuation reflected it exactly. Fact 46. The bombing of the Dutch city of Middelburg in May 1940 produced a specific and lasting image of what the German campaign in the West meant for civilian populations. Middelburg was a small historic city in the province of Zeeland, a place of canals and medieval architecture that had nothing to do with military resistance. When German forces bombed it on May 17, 1940, they destroyed the city centre and severely damaged the historic town hall, one of the finest examples of Gothic architecture in the Netherlands. The bombing was not a strategic necessity. It was part of a pattern of attacking civilian and cultural targets to accelerate Dutch collapse and demonstrate the cost of resistance. Middelburg was one of dozens of Dutch cities and towns struck in the brief campaign that led to Dutch surrender. The concentrated destruction of historic urban fabric, churches, town halls, market squares that had stood for centuries across the Netherlands in May 1940 produced a particular form of cultural grief that was different from the grief of personal loss. Communities whose physical history had been destroyed in days found themselves confronting not just the loss of buildings, but the loss of the irreplaceable record of who they had been, the architecture that made a place recognizable as itself, and that was now simply gone. Some things can be rebuilt, some cannot. The distinction between those two categories is one of the quieter cruelties of what war does to cities. Fact 47. The citizens of besieged cities across Europe and Asia developed practical knowledge that no peacetime education had prepared them for. Knowledge about the specific sound that preceded a bomb's impact, about which side of a building to shelter on when a raid was coming from a particular direction, about how to calculate the time between a flash and a sound to estimate how far away an explosion was. This knowledge was accumulated through experience and passed between neighbors and community members as a form of practical survival education that had no official curriculum and no textbook. Children in Leningrad knew which buildings to avoid and which shelters to trust. Children in London knew the difference between the sound of a V1 flying bomb's engine cutting out, which meant the bomb was falling somewhere close, and the sustained sound that meant it was going to pass overhead. Children in Malta knew the tunnel system beneath their neighborhood by feel, in complete darkness. This accumulated knowledge was a form of adaptation that researchers have since described as both impressive and troubling. Impressive because of the human capacity it demonstrated, troubling because of what its existence said about the conditions that made it necessary. No child should need to know which side of a building to stand on during a raid. The fact that hundreds of thousands of children learned this, and learned it thoroughly, is a measure of what those cities asked of the people who happened to be living inside them. Fact 48. Tobruk was besieged twice. The Libyan port city, held by Allied forces, was first surrounded by Axis troops in April 1941 and held out for 241 days before being relieved in November 1941. One of the longest sieges of the North African campaign, and was then lost to Rommel's forces in June 1942 in a rapid German assault that shocked the Allied command and Churchill personally, who learned of the fall while meeting Roosevelt in Washington. The two sieges of Tobruk were fought primarily by military forces, but the city had a civilian population whose experience of living inside a contested port under sustained aerial and artillery bombardment was its own specific and sustained ordeal. Supply convoys attempting to reach the garrison ran a continuous gauntlet of air attack, and the port facilities that made Tobruk worth fighting over were the primary target of both sides simultaneously. The Allies defending them to receive supplies, the Axis attacking them to cut those supplies off. The civilian population who remained through both sieges experienced the war not as a distant event reported in newspapers, but as a physical constant, the vibration of artillery, the smoke of burning supply ships, the specific smell of a port city under military pressure, and the knowledge that the fighting happening around them was happening over their streets and their homes and their ordinary daily lives. Fact 49. Kyoto was saved from the atomic bomb by one man's personal intervention. The United States Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, had visited Kyoto before the war and understood its significance as Japan's ancient imperial capital and the center of its cultural and religious heritage. When the Target Committee was selecting Japanese cities for atomic bombing in 1945, Kyoto was on the initial list. Its size and concentration of population made it a militarily relevant target. Stimson personally intervened to remove Kyoto from the list, overriding the objections of military planners, on the grounds that destroying Japan's most culturally significant city would create a bitterness in the Japanese people that would make post-war reconciliation genuinely impossible. His intervention succeeded, and Nagasaki was added to the target list in Kyoto's place. The people of Kyoto therefore survived the atomic age's first deployments in combat without knowing for some time how close they had come or who had interceded on their behalf. The decision is one of the war's clearest examples of a single individual's judgment changing the fate of an entire city, and simultaneously changing the fate of the approximately 60,000 to 80,000 people in Nagasaki who died instead. One man's intervention, one city saved, one city destroyed. The difference between them was one conversation. Fact 50. The city of Coventry gave a word to the world. After the bombing of November 1940, The German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels used the German verb Coventryeren, to coventrate, to describe the complete destruction of a city by aerial bombardment. The word was intended as a boast, a demonstration of the Luftwaffe's capacity to obliterate a city in a single night. It entered the German language briefly as a term for total urban destruction from the air. What Goebbels did not anticipate was that the RAF would subsequently demonstrate the same capacity on German cities at a scale that made the Coventry raid look modest by comparison. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, and dozens of other German cities would be struck with bomb loads that dwarfed what had fallen on Coventry. The verb Coventryeren quietly disappeared from German usage as the cities it was describing became increasingly German ones. The word's trajectory, coined in triumph, abandoned in recognition of what that triumph had invited in return, is a small linguistic record of the way the strategic bombing war escalated from a single devastating raid on a Midland city to a campaign that consumed entire urban civilizations on both sides, a boast that became a warning that became a silence. Language catching up, slowly, to reality. Fact 51. Warsaw's Jewish ghetto was established in October 1940, confining approximately 400,000 people, the largest Jewish community in Europe, within a walled area of 3.5 square kilometers in the heart of the city. The ghetto's population was fed at starvation levels by deliberate German policy, and an estimated 83,000 people died of hunger and disease inside it before the deportations to Treblinka began in July 1942. Approximately 265,000 people were transported to the death camp between July and September of that year. The approximately 55,000 who remained in the ghetto afterward were mostly young people who had obtained work papers. Those who had, by skill or luck, not been taken yet. On April 19, 1943, the eve of Passover, the remaining ghetto fighters rose against the German forces that came to complete the deportations. The uprising lasted approximately 4 weeks. Fought by a few hundred poorly armed fighters against a force equipped with artillery, tanks, and flamethrowers. The ghetto was destroyed building by building. The uprising ended on May 16th, when the SS commander ordered the demolition of the Great Synagogue as a symbolic conclusion. The people who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising knew from the beginning that they could not win. They chose to fight anyway, because the manner of dying was the only choice that remained available to them. They made it count. Fact 52. Occupied Oslo wore the signs of German control with a specific Norwegian bitterness. Norway had declared neutrality at the outbreak of war, and was invaded without warning on April 9, 1940, in a simultaneous German assault on multiple Norwegian ports that caught the country's military entirely unprepared. The Norwegian king and government escaped to Britain, and a collaborationist government under Vidkun Quisling, whose name subsequently entered multiple languages as a synonym for traitor, was established under German supervision. Oslo's occupation lasted 5 years and produced a civilian resistance culture of quiet daily defiance, wearing flowers or paperclips as symbols of solidarity, refusing to sit next to German soldiers on public transport, maintaining invisible social walls around the occupiers while publicly performing compliance. The Norwegian teachers' strike of 1942, in which the majority of Norway's teachers refused en masse to join the Nazi-controlled teachers' organization, resulted in the arrest of over 1,000 teachers and their deportation to forced labor camps in the north. The German administration eventually backed down. The teachers returned. The episode was one of the clearest demonstrations in occupied Europe that organized, non-violent mass resistance could succeed against an occupying power, at significant personal cost, but without the catastrophic reprisals that armed resistance typically provoked. Oslo's quiet resistance was a different kind of courage, no less real for being quiet. Fact 53. The fall of Hong Kong on Christmas Day, 1941, delivered 1.5 million people into Japanese occupation simultaneously. The colony had been defended for 18 days after the Japanese attack began on December 8, the day after Pearl Harbor. When the governor surrendered on December 25, a date the colony's population remembered afterward as Black Christmas, The civilians of Hong Kong became subject to an occupation whose first weeks were characterized by widespread violence and the specific brutality that accompanied Japanese military victories across the Pacific in late 1941 and early 1942. Food shortages developed rapidly as the Japanese military commandeered supplies, and the colonial administration's infrastructure was replaced by a military government that had little concern for civilian welfare. The occupation lasted 3 years and 8 months, during which the civilian population fell from approximately 1.5 million to around 600,000, as people fled or were forcibly repatriated to mainland China. Those who remained endured food rationing, forced labor, currency manipulation that destroyed personal savings, and the sustained weight of living under a military administration in which the ordinary protections of civil life had simply ceased to apply. Not suspended, not reduced, simply gone as if they had never been there, leaving people to navigate daily life with no floor beneath them. Fact 54. The city of Caen's civilians who sheltered in the Abbaye aux Hommes during the Battle of 1944 experienced something that war rarely provides: a sanctuary that actually held. The 11th century stone abbey became a refuge for approximately 2,000 civilians when the fighting began in June 1944. Its thick Norman stonework absorbed blast damage that would have killed people in lighter structures. The Red Cross flag was displayed on the building, and by some combination of military restraint and fortune, it was respected by both sides. The civilians inside lived in the abbey for weeks as the battle raged outside, sleeping on stone floors, sharing whatever food was available, listening to artillery through walls that were 8 centuries old. When British forces finally reached the abbey in July 1944, they found the building intact and the people inside it alive. The contrast between the Abbaye aux Hommes and the rest of Caen, 3/4 destroyed, thousands dead, was absolute and inexplicable in any purely rational military terms. The abbey survived because the walls were thick, the flags were flying, and on that particular stretch of a battle that killed thousands, nobody chose to fire at it. In a battle defined by destruction, the survival of one building and the 2,000 people inside it was an accident of mercy. A small, quiet, inexplicable mercy, but a real one. Fact 55. Belgrade was bombed a second time on Easter Sunday, April 16, 1944, 3 years after the first Easter Sunday bombing of 1941. This time the bombers were American, part of a campaign to destroy German transport and oil infrastructure in the Balkans. The target was Belgrade's marshalling yards and railway infrastructure. The bombs also struck residential neighborhoods, killing approximately 1,160 civilians. The coincidence of date, Easter Sunday again, was not intentional on the American side, but it was felt with particular bitterness by Belgrade's population, who had buried the memory of the 1941 raid and now found the anniversary arriving in the form of a second one. Belgrade's experience of being bombed by both sides of the war, first by Germany in 1941 as a punishment for resistance, then by the Allies in 1944 as a consequence of being occupied by Germany, was shared by a number of European cities that found themselves on the wrong side of the front line at the wrong moment. Being bombed by the people who were coming to save you was not a contradiction anyone had an adequate language for. The city was liberated, eventually. The 2 Easter mornings stayed in the memory of the people who had been there for the rest of their lives. Fact 56. The Maltese language contains words for types of bomb damage that exist in no other European language, coined during the years of sustained bombing because the existing vocabulary was simply inadequate for what people were experiencing every day. Language adapts to reality, and when reality changes fast enough and completely enough, the language changes with it. Across all the cities that lived through sustained bombing, the practical vocabulary of daily life shifted to incorporate the new conditions, words for specific types of shelter, for the sound of different aircraft engines, for the categories of bomb damage that determined whether a building could be repaired or had to be cleared. Children who grew up in these cities learned this vocabulary as naturally as they learnt the words for ordinary domestic objects, because in the world they were growing up in, it was ordinary domestic vocabulary. The linguistic record of what cities under sustained bombardment sounded and felt like is preserved partly in the words that entered everyday speech during those years, and partly in the words that were needed and coined and used, and then, as the bombing stopped and ordinary life slowly returned, gradually fell out of use, not forgotten exactly, but no longer necessary, stored in the specific memory of people who had needed them and hoped very quietly never to need them again. Fact 57. Hiroshima's survivors, known in Japanese as hibakusha, meaning explosion-affected people, faced a form of social discrimination after the war that added a human cruelty to the physical one they had already endured. The radiation sickness that killed thousands in the weeks and months following the bombing, and the radiation-related illnesses that appeared in survivors years and decades later, created a fear among other Japanese that the hibakusha was somehow contagious or permanently damaged in ways that might be passed to future generations. Hibakusha were discriminated against in employment and, most painfully, in marriage. Families refused to allow their children to marry survivors for fear of genetic damage to grandchildren. The stigma was not based on medical evidence, but it was socially powerful and lasting. Many survivors concealed their hibakusha status for years or decades, adding the burden of secrecy to the burden of illness. The Japanese government did not begin formally providing medical and financial support to hibakusha until 1957, 12 years after the bombing, and the support provided was widely considered inadequate. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who survived the bombs, survived into a world that was, in specific and documented ways, not particularly glad to have them in it. That fact sits alongside the bombing itself as part of the full account of what those cities experienced. The bomb fell once. The discrimination lasted for decades. Fact 58. The city of Minsk rebuilt itself after the war with a deliberate grandeur that was partly a statement of Soviet power and partly a response to the completeness of what had been destroyed. With 80% of the city gone, the post-war planners had, as Rotterdam had, the necessity of building something entirely new. The Soviet approach was different from the Dutch one, where Rotterdam built modern and functional, Minsk built monumental and Stalinist, with wide ceremonial boulevards lined with massive neoclassical buildings in the style that Stalin's architects had developed for Moscow. The central avenue was designed to impress and to endure, broad enough to hold military parades, flanked by buildings whose scale communicated the ambition of a state that had been nearly destroyed and was insisting through architecture that it had not merely survived but prevailed. The Minsk that emerged from post-war reconstruction bore almost no physical resemblance to the pre-war city. The streets were wider, the buildings were larger, the scale was entirely different. Whether that constituted a restoration or a replacement was a question that residents were not officially encouraged to ask, though many of them, walking the wide new boulevards above the buried memory of what had stood there before, asked it privately anyway. The buildings were new. What lay beneath them was not. Fact 59. The city of Leningrad kept a metronome broadcasting on the radio throughout the siege. When there was no programming, no music, no news, no official transmission, the radio stations broadcast the sound of a metronome beating steadily, because the silence of a dead radio signal in a besieged city was itself a kind of fear. The metronome meant the city was still functioning. It meant the stations were still operational, that someone was still there to keep them running, that the basic infrastructure of civic life was intact. Leningraders who survived the siege described the sound of the metronome as one of the defining memories of those years. Lying in the dark, weakened by hunger, listening to the steady beat coming from the radio and taking from it the specific reassurance that the city was still alive. When the metronome stopped and a voice came on the air, it meant either programming was beginning or there was a raid warning. When it continued without interruption, it meant everything was, in the limited sense, available, all right. The choice to broadcast a metronome rather than silence was a small, deliberate decision by someone in the Leningrad radio administration. Its psychological effect on the city's population was entirely disproportionate to its simplicity. Sometimes the most important thing a city can do for its people is simply keep making a sound, just to say, we are still here. Fact 60. The children of Warsaw who survived the war grew up in a city that had to be rebuilt almost completely from scratch, and the rebuilding was itself a form of collective psychological statement. The decision to reconstruct Warsaw's old town, the medieval city center that had been systematically demolished by German forces in 1944, as accurately as possible, was made consciously and at enormous effort. Architects and historians worked from pre-war photographs, paintings, and architectural records to reconstruct facades, street layouts, and decorative details with a precision that earned the rebuilt Old Town a UNESCO World Heritage designation in 1980. An extraordinary recognition for a reconstruction rather than an original. The rebuilt Warsaw was not the same as the Warsaw that had been destroyed. It was a reconstruction, a deliberate act of cultural memory given physical form. But it was a statement that the city refused to be erased, refused to accept the permanence of its own destruction, refused to let the demolition units have the final word about what Warsaw was. The children who grew up in the rebuilt city walked streets that looked old but were new, in a city that looked continuous but had been interrupted. And the gap between the appearance of continuity and the reality of rupture was something that Warsaw's relationship with its own history has been navigating, with great honesty and great difficulty, ever since. Fact 61. Athens under occupation developed a resistance culture that expressed itself partly through food. The famine of 1941 to 1942 had killed tens of thousands, but it had also produced networks of mutual aid, neighborhood soup kitchens, informal food-sharing arrangements, the quiet redistribution of whatever was available to those who had least. These networks, organized largely by women and by community organizations including the Red Cross and the Church, were themselves a form of resistance. Not armed, not confrontational, but systematic and organized in direct defiance of an occupation that was content to let the city starve. The black market that flourished in Athens throughout the occupation was similarly double-edged. It was a form of economic crime by occupation law, and it was also the mechanism by which a significant proportion of the population obtained enough food to survive. Participating in the black market was therefore simultaneously an illegal act and an act of survival, and the moral calculation that occupation required Athenians to apply to their own daily behavior, which rules to break, which to comply with, which forms of cooperation with the occupier were necessary, and which were betrayal, was one of the most demanding psychological challenges that the occupation imposed on the city's civilian population. There were no clean answers. There were only the choices people made, day by day, in conditions where every option had a cost. Fact 62. The bombing of Wayleen on September 1, 1939, may have been the first deliberate attack on a civilian target of the entire war. Wayleen was a small Polish city of approximately 16,000 people, with no significant military garrison and no strategic importance. At 4:40 in the morning, before the official German declaration of war, Luftwaffe aircraft bombed the city center, destroying approximately 75% of its buildings and killing between 1,200 and 1,300 civilians. The city's hospital, clearly marked with a red cross, was among the first buildings hit. The bombing of Willen was not a mistake or collateral damage. It was a deliberate attack on a civilian population as a demonstration of what German air power intended to do. As such, it represents the moment when the Second World War's assault on civilian populations began. Not in the skies over London or Rotterdam or Leningrad, but in a small Polish city at dawn on the first morning of the conflict, in an attack so early and so disproportionate that the people of Yelen had no warning, no preparation, and no understanding of what was happening to them before it was already done. The war began with a city that most people have never heard of. That is itself a kind of fact. Fact 63. The experience of living under occupation created specific and lasting changes in how people related to public and private space. Under German occupation across Europe, public space was contaminated. It was the space of the occupier, of checkpoints and identity papers and curfews and the specific threat of being stopped and questioned by someone with authority to detain or shoot you. Private space, the home, the apartment, the cellar, became correspondingly precious, the one domain that the occupier did not entirely control. Families who had previously lived outward-facing lives, spending time in cafes and parks and public squares, turned inward during occupation, organizing their social lives around domestic spaces that felt relatively safe. This inward turn shaped the culture of occupied cities in ways that outlasted the occupation itself. A heightened value placed on the domestic sphere, a wariness of public life, a habit of privacy that had been learned as a survival strategy and was slow to unlearn. The specific wariness of occupied populations toward public authority, the knowledge that officials and uniforms could not be taken at face value, that compliance was not the same as safety, was another legacy of occupation that shaped civic cultures across Europe for decades after the liberation. The occupation ended. The weariness took much longer to leave. Fact 64. Hamburg's survival after Operation Gomorrah was partly a story of the limits of what even catastrophic bombing could permanently destroy. The firestorm of July 1943 killed approximately 37,000 people and destroyed large portions of the city's residential fabric. The 1 million survivors who fled into the surrounding countryside in the days that followed were, within weeks, beginning to return. The city's industrial and port infrastructure was damaged but not destroyed, and Hamburg's wartime production resumed within months of the raid. The people who came back to the ruined residential areas did not come back to livable conditions. They came back to rubble and collapsed buildings, and the specific smell of a firestorm's aftermath that residents described as unlike anything else in the world. But they came back because the city was where their lives were, and the alternatives, staying in the countryside, relocating entirely, starting over somewhere else, required resources and decision-making capacity that most people, in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, simply did not have. The human tendency to return to familiar places, even places that have been destroyed, was one of the consistent and somewhat counterintuitive findings of wartime urban studies. Cities that planners expected to be abandoned after catastrophic raids were instead partially repopulated within weeks, by people whose attachment to place proved stronger than the destruction of the place itself. Fact 65. Leningrad's Road of Life was the only connection between the besieged city and the rest of the Soviet Union for most of the siege, and it was a route that killed many of the people who tried to use it. When Lake Ladoga, which bordered the city's eastern edge, froze in November 1941, Soviet authorities began driving supply trucks across the ice, a route that was faster than any alternative, but which required the ice to be thick enough to bear the weight of loaded vehicles. The trucks drove in columns across the frozen lake at night, without lights, trying to avoid German aircraft and the patches of thin ice that appeared unpredictably. Vehicles broke through regularly, sinking in minutes in water cold enough to kill almost instantly. The drivers who made the crossing successfully brought food into the city and took evacuees, children, the elderly, the critically ill, out. Approximately 1.5 million civilians were evacuated across the Road of Life between November 1941 and March 1942, and approximately 1.5 million tons of supplies were brought into the city over the course of the siege. The route saved the city. It also killed an unknown number of drivers and evacuees who went through the ice in the dark, in vehicles that sank before anyone could reach them, in water that was so cold and so dark and so complete that it gave nothing back. Fact 66. The city of Coventry developed a particular relationship with reconciliation after the war that set it apart from most bombed European cities. Rather than focusing its post-war identity primarily on what had been done to it, Coventry chose to make the experience of bombing into a foundation for dialogue with former enemies. The city established formal reconciliation partnerships with Dresden, Stalingrad, and Hiroshima, 3 cities that had also endured catastrophic bombing on the other side of the same conflict. The Cross of Nails Ministry, founded on the charred wooden cross found in the ruins of the old cathedral, sent replicas to churches and communities around the world as symbols of reconciliation, building a network that now includes over 200 member institutions in more than 40 countries. The choice to respond to destruction with reconciliation rather than commemoration of victimhood was not universally welcomed in Coventry. Some residents felt the city's suffering was being dissolved into a universal narrative that failed to acknowledge who had actually caused it. But the choice was made and sustained, and Coventry's identity as a city of reconciliation became as specific and as real as its wartime identity as a bombed city. Both things were true simultaneously, and the tension between them was part of what made the city's engagement with its own history unusually and genuinely honest. Fact 67. The Soviet city of Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd in 1961 as part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, the systematic removal of Stalin's name from public places following the official denunciation of Stalin's crimes. The renaming created a strange historical gap. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front was named after a city that no longer had that name, fought in defense of a leader who was now officially disgraced. Veterans of the battle continued to call it by its wartime name. The memorial complex built on Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that had been the most bitterly contested point of the entire battle, used the name Stalingrad in its inscriptions because calling it anything else would have been historically dishonest. The city held a referendum in 2013 on whether to restore the name Stalingrad for 6 days per year on historically significant dates. The result was yes, and on Victory Day and other commemorative occasions the city's official name temporarily reverts to the name under which it endured the battle that defined it. The question of what to call a city that carries within its name both a crime and a heroism has no clean answer, and Volgograd's periodic return to Stalingrad is an acknowledgement of that irresolution rather than a resolution of it. Some things are too complicated to resolve. You can only be honest about the complication. Fact 68. The people of besieged cities across Europe and Asia developed collective rituals around moments of greatest danger that served psychological functions beyond the purely practical. In Leningrad, people formed specific habits around the artillery bombardments, times of day when shelling was most frequent, routes across the city that offered most protection, the unspoken etiquette of shelter life that developed when large numbers of people spent long periods of enforced proximity in confined spaces. In London, the underground shelters developed their own social hierarchies and unwritten rules. Regular shelterers had acknowledged spots on the platforms. Newcomers were oriented by established residents. Small communities formed around specific stations that became regular refuges for the same people night after night. In Malta, the movement to the tunnels became so practiced that it happened almost without conscious decision. The sound of the warning siren triggered a physical response that bypassed deliberate thought. These rituals were not merely efficient, they were a form of social structure imposed on chaos, a way of maintaining the forms of community and normalcy inside conditions that had removed all the ordinary supports of both. They said, "We are still people who have customs and consideration for each other. Even here, even now, even when everything outside these walls is trying to make that untrue." Fact 69. Rotterdam's 1,150 civilian dead from the May 1940 raid were for decades cited as 30,000 in many accounts, a figure that came from initial estimates made in the chaos of the immediate aftermath and repeated widely before careful research established the real number. The discrepancy matters not because 1,150 deaths are unimportant, they are not, but because the inflated figure shaped the international understanding of what had happened and contributed directly to the Dutch government's decision to surrender the following day. The psychological and political impact of the Rotterdam bombing was significantly out of proportion to its actual casualty count, partly because of the inflated estimates and partly because of the speed and totality of the city centre's destruction, which communicated something about German intent and capability that the accurate death toll alone would not have conveyed. The gap between the number that shaped events and the number that research subsequently established is a reminder that in wartime, the meaning of an event is often determined not by its actual scale, but by the scale that people believe it to have been, and that belief, once formed and acted upon, can change the course of events as surely as the event itself. Perception moved faster than truth, it usually does. Fact 70. The city of Cologne lost its famous cathedral by a margin that was in retrospect astonishing. The Kölner Dom, the Gothic cathedral that had taken 632 years to build and stood as one of the largest Gothic churches in the world, was struck by bombs 14 times during the war. 14 times. Each time, the damage was significant but not fatal to the structure. The cathedral's massive stone construction, its lack of inflammable materials in the main fabric, and what its post-war custodians described as something close to providence combined to preserve it through 363 Allied air raids on the city and a ground battle in March 1945. When American forces entered Cologne in that final month of the war, they found a city of almost complete devastation, approximately 95% of the inner city destroyed, and rising from the rubble, intact if damaged, the two spires of the cathedral. The image of the Cologne Cathedral standing above the ruins became one of the defining photographs of the war's final months. A single surviving structure in a landscape of destruction. Its survival so improbable that it seemed to ask for an explanation beyond structural engineering. Whether that explanation was spiritual or simply statistical, the cathedral stood, and its standing became the point around which Cologne rebuilt itself. Fact 71. The specific terror of the V1 flying bomb, which Germany began launching against London and southern England in June 1944, was different in character from the terror of the conventional Blitz. The V1 was an unmanned pulse jet aircraft loaded with approximately 850 kilograms of explosives, and it was audible from a significant distance. Its engine produced a distinctive buzzing sound that Londoners quickly named the doodlebug. The terror was not in the sound. It was in the silence. When the engine cut out, meaning the fuel was exhausted and the bomb was beginning its descent, there were approximately 12 seconds before impact. Those 12 seconds, during which people dived under tables, pressed themselves against walls, or simply froze and waited, were the most feared interval of the entire later Blitz. You could hear it coming, you could hear it stop, and then you had 12 seconds to decide what to do, with nowhere certain to go. Between June and September 1944, approximately 6,000 V1s reached London or its surroundings, killing approximately 6,000 people. The V2 ballistic missile that followed gave no warning at all, arriving faster than sound. People in London found themselves, in the autumn of 1944, preferring the weapon that gave them no warning to the one that gave them just enough to be afraid. That preference tells you something specific about what those 12 seconds felt like. Fact 72. The city of Nanjing's post-war memory of the massacre was suppressed and contested in ways that shaped Chinese and Japanese relations for the rest of the 20th century. The Japanese government's official position shifted over the decades, with some administrations acknowledging atrocities, others minimizing them, and nationalist historians periodically producing work that questioned the scale of what had happened. Chinese official memory kept the events as a central national trauma, building the memorial hall for the victims of the Nanjing massacre into one of the most visited memorial sites in China. The gap between how Japan and China remembered and officially characterized the same events was a persistent source of diplomatic tension, flaring into public controversy whenever Japanese textbooks revised their treatment of the massacre, or when senior Japanese officials visited the Yasukuni Shrine. The city of Nanjing therefore carried not only the memory of what had happened within its boundaries in 1937, but the ongoing burden of being the primary site of a historical dispute that neither nation had found a way to resolve. A city whose past was not settled history but active argument, argued over in government statements, in textbooks, in diplomatic meetings, in the space between two countries that could not agree on what one of them had done to the other. The city stood. The argument continued. Fact 73. Berlin's civilian population in the final weeks of the war faced a particular form of fear that was different from anything that had preceded it, the fear of their own liberators. As Soviet forces closed in on the city in April 1945, and as the propaganda that German civilians had been fed for years about Soviet brutality intersected with genuine accounts of what had happened in East Prussia and Pomerania, the civilian population of Berlin, predominantly women, children, and the elderly, faced the approaching Soviet army with a terror that was, in significant measure, justified. The mass violence that accompanied the Soviet advance into Germany has been documented by historians, and Berlin itself was one of the primary sites. Women hid in cellars, in attics, in hospital wards, attempting to make themselves invisible to the soldiers moving through the city. The liberation of Berlin was simultaneously an end of Nazi rule, a military defeat, and a civilian catastrophe that the city's surviving population experienced with a complexity of feeling, relief and terror and grief and shame and exhaustion that no single narrative of liberation or defeat could adequately contain. Both things were true. The war was over, and what had happened in the ending of it was something the city would take decades to fully find the language for. Fact 74. The city of Stalingrad produced a single image that became one of the most reproduced photographs of the entire war. A Soviet soldier raising the red flag above the ruined city in February 1943. Like many iconic war photographs, it was staged. The flag raising was reconstructed for the camera after the actual moment, with better light than the original event had allowed. The staging does not make the image dishonest in any important sense. Soviet forces had genuinely retaken the city. The flag was genuinely raised. The event the image depicted had genuinely occurred. What the staging reveals is the understanding, present even in 1943, that the image of Stalingrad's liberation needed to be right, not just documented but composed, not just recorded but made into something that would last and carry meaning beyond the specific moment. The photograph was used extensively in Soviet propaganda, in Allied propaganda, and in post-war commemoration. It stands now as the visual shorthand for the Battle of Stalingrad in the way that a few other images stand as shorthand for other defining moments of the war, images so thoroughly incorporated into the collective memory of an event that it becomes almost impossible to think about the event without seeing them. The photograph outlasted the politics that shaped it. That tends to be what photographs do. Fact 75. The city of Warsaw's liberation in January 1945 was unlike the liberation of any other European capital. Soviet forces that entered the city on January 17th did not find a damaged or occupied city waiting to be freed. They found rubble. The systematic German demolition that had followed the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in October 1944 had reduced approximately 85% of the city's buildings to ruins by the time liberation came. The handful of civilians still living in the ruins, approximately 1,000 people, came out from their cellars to meet the arriving soldiers in a city barely recognizable as a city. There were no crowds lining the streets, no flowers thrown from windows, no bells ringing. Most of the church towers were gone. The liberation of Warsaw was quiet, muted, conducted in a landscape of absence so complete that the usual gestures of liberation had no stage to be performed on. What remained was the simple fact of it. The Germans were gone, the city was free, the war in Poland was effectively over, and the people who had survived long enough to experience that fact stood in the ruins of their city and understood that freedom and destruction were not opposites. They had both arrived at exactly the same time. Fact 76. The city of Hiroshima built its Peace Memorial Park on the Hypocenter, the point directly below the atomic bomb's detonation, and the choice of that specific location was deliberate and significant. At the park's center stands the A-bomb dome, the partial ruin of the former Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, one of the very few structures close to the Hypocenter that remained partially standing after the blast. The decision to preserve the dome, to leave it as it was rather than demolishing it as part of the city's reconstruction, was controversial in Hiroshima for years. Some survivors wanted it gone, finding the ruin a source of ongoing trauma rather than a monument. Others insisted it must remain precisely because of that quality, because a monument to the atomic bombing should not be comfortable to look at, and that the discomfort it produced was the point. The dome was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996, over the objections of the United States and China, whose governments felt the designation risked portraying Japan solely as a victim rather than acknowledging its role as aggressor. The tension between those two things, Japan as perpetrator of a catastrophic war and Hiroshima as site of a catastrophic weapon, is something the city has navigated with more honesty and complexity than most nations manage when they are simultaneously both things at once. Fact 77. Leningrad's 900 days of siege produced a specific kind of community solidarity that researchers have studied as one of the most documented examples of collective human resilience under extreme conditions. The shared deprivation, the shared danger, the complete dependence of every individual on the functioning of collective systems, all of these created a social cohesion that peacetime life rarely generates. People shared food they could barely spare. Neighbors carried water for those too weak to carry it themselves. Factory workers maintained production schedules that had no rational justification given their physical condition. The cultural institutions that kept operating did so not because anyone ordered them to, but because the people involved understood that maintaining the forms of civilized life was itself a form of resistance, a daily insistence that the city remained what it had been. This solidarity was not universal. The siege also produced theft and hoarding and violence. But the dominant pattern that the siege produced was one of collective endurance rather than individual survival at others' expense. That pattern is part of why the city held for 872 days, and why its people's relationship to those days remains one of the most complex and meaningful legacies of the entire war. They endured something together that very few communities in history have been asked to endure. And they did it together. Fact 78. The city of Dresden's post-war memory divided along Cold War lines in a way that shaped how the bombing was understood for decades. East Germany used the bombing as a propaganda tool, framing it as a Western Allied war crime against a civilian population and a cultural treasure, emphasizing the highest possible casualty estimates, using the destruction as evidence of Western moral bankruptcy. This framing served obvious political purposes, but was not entirely dishonest. The bombing of Dresden was and remains genuinely controversial, and the questions it raises about the limits of legitimate military action are real ones. West Germany and the Western Allied nations tended to minimize or justify the bombing, emphasizing Dresden's role as a transport hub, questioning the casualty estimates, framing the raid as a legitimate military operation. Both framings were partial. Both contained elements of truth and elements of self-interest. The Independent Historical Commission established by the city of Dresden in 2004, which published its findings in 2010, concluded that approximately 25,000 people had been killed. This figure was accepted by most historians as the most reliable available, though it satisfied neither those who had claimed 250,000 nor those who wanted the bombing declared fully justified. Some events resist clean conclusions. Dresden is one of them. Fact 79. The city of Coventry's medieval street plan survived in its outlines even where the buildings did not. The bomb damage that destroyed the city centre in November 1940 cleared the buildings but left the street layout largely intact, and the post-war reconstruction followed those pre-existing lines rather than redesigning the city from scratch as Rotterdam had done. The result was a city whose streets felt familiar to those who had known pre-war Coventry, but whose buildings were almost entirely new, a hybrid of old bones and new flesh that captured something of both the continuity and the rupture that post-war urban life across Europe had to negotiate. The pedestrianized city centre that emerged from the reconstruction, one of the first in Britain, was a deliberate modernization, reflecting post-war planning priorities around separating pedestrians from motor vehicles. The new cathedral beside the old ruins was the centerpiece of a rebuilt civic space trying to be both a memorial and a living city at the same time. The tension between those two purposes, a place that commemorates destruction and a place where people shop and work and go about their lives, is one that every rebuilt city carries. Coventry carries it with more deliberate self-awareness than most, because the decision to make that tension visible and conscious was itself part of the rebuilding. Fact 80. Tokyo's civilian population in the final months of the war endured a sequence of destruction that left the city almost unrecognizable by August 1945. The firebombing campaign that began with the March 9th to 10th raid continued through the spring and summer, with American B-29s returning repeatedly to strike different districts. By the time of Japan's surrender, approximately half of Tokyo's built-up area had been destroyed. Approximately 267,000 buildings had been burned, and somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people had been killed in the raids. The surviving population had largely been evacuated to the countryside, or was living in whatever undamaged housing remained on the city's outskirts. The city center was, in many districts, simply gone. Open ground where dense urban fabric had stood, cleared by fire rather than demolition. The people who returned to Tokyo after the surrender in August 1945 returned to a city that was, in large portions, a field of ash and twisted metal, from which the reconstruction of Japan's capital and the simultaneous American occupation that supervised that reconstruction would begin. Tokyo rebuilt with extraordinary speed. Within a generation it had become one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world, but the city it became was built on the ground where the old one had stood, and the old one's absence is part of what the new one is. Fact 81. The experience of Maltese civilians during the most intense period of the siege, April and May 1942, when the island was struck by approximately 6,700 tons of bombs in a single month, was described by the island's governor as comparable to a sustained military offensive rather than a conventional bombing campaign. The density of raids during those months was such that the island's anti-aircraft defenses were firing almost continuously. The RAF's defending fighters were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and the civilian population was spending a significant portion of each day underground. Food supplies on the island were reduced to the point where military and civilian rations were being calculated in terms of weeks of remaining supply. The convoy operation Pedestal in August 1942, in which 14 ships set out for Malta and 5 arrived, including the heavily damaged tanker SS Ohio kept afloat by 2 destroyers lashed to her sides, is regarded as the operation that saved Malta from having to surrender. The oil carried by the Ohio, towed into Grand Harbor listing heavily with the destroyers still attached, was barely enough. The margin between Malta's survival and its capitulation in the summer of 1942 was measured in days of remaining fuel, in the number of aircraft that could still fly, and in the endurance of a civilian population that had been under assault for 2 years and had not yet found the bottom of what it was capable of bearing. As it turned out, that bottom never came. Fact 82. The city of Kyiv was liberated by Soviet forces on November 6, 1943, and the liberation date was not accidental. The following day was the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and Stalin had requested that the city be taken before the anniversary so that its liberation could be announced as a revolutionary holiday gift. The military pressure to meet a political deadline produced an assault that succeeded in retaking the city, but at a cost in casualties that a less time-constrained operation might have reduced. The symbolism of the date mattered to Soviet propaganda. Kiev was the mother city of Russian civilization in the Soviet historical narrative, and its liberation on the eve of the revolution's anniversary was a powerful image. The city that was liberated on November 6 had been under German occupation for over 2 years. It had lost approximately 195,000 of its pre-war population of 930,000. The Babi Yar massacre had taken place in its outskirts. Its Jewish community had been almost entirely eliminated. Its infrastructure had been destroyed. The city that Soviet soldiers entered on November 6 was free, in the specific and important sense that German forces were no longer there. Everything else that freedom meant, the rebuilding, the reckoning, the recovery, would take considerably longer to arrive. Fact 83. The children who grew up in bombed and occupied cities across Europe and Asia carried the physical marks of their wartime childhoods into adulthood in ways that were visible for decades afterward. Studies of British evacuees conducted in the 1990s found elevated rates of anxiety disorders, attachment difficulties and post-traumatic stress symptoms in people who had been evacuated as children, particularly those whose placements with host families had been unhappy, or who had returned to find family circumstances significantly changed. Studies of Leningrad survivors found that people who had been children during the siege showed higher rates of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, and psychological difficulties in late life than comparable populations who had not experienced the siege. The physical effects of childhood starvation leaving markers in the body still measurable 60 years later. The children of bombed and occupied cities did not simply grow up and leave the war behind. They grew up carrying it inside them, in specific physiological and psychological ways that research gradually made visible. The war ended in their cities on specific dates. It continued in their bodies and their minds for the rest of their lives, diminishing as time passed but never fully disappearing. A legacy written not in buildings or archives but in the biological record of what extreme experience does to a child who lives through it and keeps on living. Fact 84. The city of Manila's post-war reconstruction required not only rebuilding but a reckoning with what had actually happened during the Battle of February and March 1945. The 100,000 Filipino civilian deaths, many of them in Japanese massacres in the final days of the battle, others killed by American artillery, were for years overshadowed in the dominant American narrative of the Pacific War by the military dimensions of the campaign. Filipino memory of the battle was more complicated, holding simultaneously the liberation from Japanese occupation and the destruction wrought by the battle itself, including the American artillery fire that killed Filipino civilians in order to destroy Japanese positions in residential buildings. The old walled city of Intramuros, the Spanish colonial heart of Manila, built in the 16th century, was completely destroyed during the battle and has never been fully restored to its pre-war state. The reconstruction of Manila focused on practical rebuilding rather than historical preservation, and the city that emerged from the post-war years was substantially modern rather than a restoration of what had been lost. The cultural and architectural heritage destroyed in 4 weeks of fighting in 1945 had taken 4 centuries to accumulate. The speed of its destruction relative to the time it had taken to build was one of the measures of what urban warfare in the 20th century was capable of doing to everything a city had taken generations to become. Fact 85. The German city of Würzburg was destroyed in 17 minutes on March 16, 1945, with the war in Europe less than 8 weeks from its end. 225 RAF Lancaster bombers attacked the city in a raid that lasted from 9:20 to 9:37 in the evening. Würzburg was a Baroque masterpiece of 18th century German architecture with limited military significance, struck as part of a broader campaign against smaller German cities in the war's final months. A firestorm developed rapidly, killing approximately 5,000 people and destroying approximately 89% of the city's built-up area. The Würzburg residence, one of the finest Baroque palaces in Europe, was severely damaged but subsequently restored in a post-war reconstruction project that took decades and became one of the most ambitious historic preservation efforts in German history. 17 minutes of bombing in 1945 produced a restoration project that lasted a generation, a debate about proportionality that has never been fully resolved, and a city that looks today much as it looked before the bombers came. The restoration was extraordinary. The debate about whether the bombing was necessary at that stage of the war, with Germany already weeks from total defeat, is one that historians have not found a clean answer to. Some questions from those years resist clean answers. This is one of them. Fact 86. The children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki who survived the atomic bombings and lived into adulthood faced a medical reality that no previous generation had encountered. The long-term health effects of radiation exposure. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established by the United States in 1947, studied the surviving population for decades, tracking rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, and other radiation-related conditions. The studies found elevated rates of leukemia appearing within a few years of the bombing and peaking approximately 6 to 8 years after exposure, followed by elevated rates of solid cancers appearing over the following decades. Children who had been closest to the epicenter and had survived showed the highest rates of radiation-related illness. The medical monitoring of the Hibakusha population produced data that became the foundation of international radiation safety standards. The children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki who survived the immediate blast therefore contributed, through their bodies and their suffering, to a body of medical knowledge that shaped how the entire world understands and regulates radiation exposure. That contribution was not voluntary. It was not adequately compensated for decades. It was made in conditions of significant social discrimination. It was, nonetheless, real, and the standards it produced have informed nuclear safety policy globally ever since. What was taken from those children became, eventually, something that protected others. That does not make what was taken acceptable, but it is part of the full account. Fact 87. The city of Amsterdam's post-war Anne Frank house, the building where the Frank family and 4 others hid in a concealed annex for more than 2 years before their arrest in August 1944, became one of the most visited memorial sites in Europe, receiving over 1 million visitors per year by the early 21st century. The house had been preserved partly by Mietjes, one of the Dutch citizens who had helped hide the Frank family, who recovered Anne's diary from the annex floor after the arrest and kept it safely until Otto Frank, the only member of the hiding group who survived the camps, returned to Amsterdam and she was able to give it back to him. Otto Frank arranged for the diary's publication in 1947. The book was translated into more than 70 languages and became one of the most widely read documents of the Holocaust. The house was opened as a museum in 1960. The combination of the diary, the physical space of the annex, and the specific details of one family's experience of hiding gave the abstract enormity of the Holocaust a human scale that statistical accounts of its magnitude could not provide. Amsterdam's role in the war's history is inseparable from the story of the Frank family and the building on Prinsengracht, a small annex in a canal house that became, through a teenager's diary, one of the most consequential rooms of the 20th century. Fact 88. The city of Leningrad was awarded the title Hero City by the Soviet Union in 1945, one of only a handful of cities to receive the designation, which recognized the military and civilian contribution to the war effort. The designation carried real material consequences. Hero cities received priority in post-war reconstruction funding, but its primary significance was symbolic, an official acknowledgement that what the city's population had endured and accomplished during the 872-day siege was extraordinary by any measure. The title created a civic identity that Leningrad, and later St. Petersburg, after the city reclaimed its pre-Soviet name in 1991, has carried ever since. The memory of the siege is woven into the city's physical fabric, in the memorial ring of monuments that encircles the city along the former front lines, in the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery where approximately 500,000 siege victims are buried in mass graves, in the museum dedicated to the siege in the city center. The siege is not simply a historical event in the city's past, it is the central experience of the city's modern identity, the thing that more than any other single fact defines what the city was and what it became, and at its center, a metronome that kept beating through the darkest of those 872 nights, so that no one who was listening would ever feel entirely alone. Fact 89. The city of Rotterdam's post-war relationship with its own destruction was complicated by the speed of both the destruction and the response. The bombing had taken 90 minutes in May 1940. Plans for reconstruction were drawn up almost immediately afterward, while the occupation was still in effect. The speed of both events meant that Rotterdam never had the extended period of living in ruins that cities like Warsaw or Leningrad endured. The German occupation administration, which needed a functioning port city, supported reconstruction efforts that kept Rotterdam's essential infrastructure operating throughout the war. The post-war rebuilding therefore began from a position of relative continuity rather than total collapse. The modernist city centre that emerged was not a reconstruction from nothing but an evolution of plans that had been developing since 1940, refined by the experience of occupation and by the practical constraints of a city that had never fully stopped functioning even in the worst of circumstances. Rotterdam's post-war architecture is often described as the most radical urban transformation in Europe, a medieval city centre replaced by a modern one within a generation. The bombing made it possible. The occupation made it necessary, the planners made it deliberate, and the result is a city whose appearance reflects, in every building and every boulevard, the specific 90 minutes that remade it. Fact 90. The city of Warsaw was rebuilt with a remarkable fidelity to its pre-war appearance that required an unusual source, the paintings of Bernardo Bellotto, an 18th-century Italian artist who had painted the city's streets with documentary precision in the 1770s. Bellotto had produced a series of paintings of Warsaw's streetscapes, so accurate in their architectural detail that post-war architects were able to use them as blueprints for rebuilding facades that no longer had any physical record. Photographs, architectural drawings, and the memories of surviving residents were also used, but Bellotto's paintings, which had survived the war in a Polish museum, provided a level of detail that no other source could match for the buildings of the Old Town. The rebuilt Warsaw Old Town that was completed in the 1950s and 1960s was partly restored from architectural records and partly restored from art, a city reconstructed from its own painted image, made possible by the accident that an 18th-century Italian painter had chosen to document its streets with unusual precision 200 years before they were destroyed. The UNESCO designation of the rebuilt Old Town as a World Heritage Site in 1980 recognized this unique form of urban reconstruction, a city rebuilt not just from memory but from art. A painter who died in 1780 helped save a city destroyed in 1944. History moves in unexpected directions. Fact 91. The city of Nagasaki's relationship with its own atomic bombing was shaped significantly by the fact that Nagasaki was not the primary target. The knowledge that the bomb had been intended for Kokura, that it had been redirected to Nagasaki by cloud cover and navigational circumstance, that the city had been destroyed by an accident of weather, this knowledge was present in Nagasaki from the beginning and gave the city's experience a specific quality that differed from Hiroshima's. Hiroshima had been the first, the deliberate choice. Nagasaki had been the second, the backup. The city destroyed because Kokura happened to be cloudy. That contingency, the sense that the city's destruction was arbitrary in a way that Hiroshima's was not, shaped how Nagasaki understood and memorialized the bombing. The Peace Park and the Atomic Bomb Museum in Nagasaki have tended to emphasize the human cost and the call for nuclear disarmament, more than the specific military history of the decision, partly because the specific military history of the decision was so hard to locate in any comprehensible framework of choice and intention. Nagasaki was destroyed because the weather was wrong somewhere else. That is not a fact that lends itself easily to the usual forms of memorial narrative. And yet the city built its memorial anyway, because some things deserve to be remembered even when the story behind them has no clean shape. Fact 92. The City of London's post-war relationship with its own bombing was shaped significantly by what did not happen, by the absence of the catastrophic civilian collapse that German planners had expected and that informed the entire theory of strategic bombing. The Blitz killed 43,500 people, destroyed 1 million homes and caused physical damage of enormous scale. It did not break London's civilian morale. It did not cause the government to seek peace. It did not produce the mass psychological collapse that air power theorists had predicted. This failure, the failure of the bombing to produce the political result it was intended to produce, was observed by both sides and contributed to a sustained debate about the effectiveness of strategic bombing that ran through the entire war. London's endurance of the Blitz became, in Allied propaganda and in British national self-understanding, a founding myth of the war. The civilian population attacked and unbroken. The city that refused to be defeated. That myth was not false. It was also, like most national myths, a simplified version of a more complicated reality, one in which there was also panic, crime, looting, class tension, and the quiet suffering of hundreds of thousands of people who never appeared in the official photographs of cheerful defiance. Both versions were true. The myth captured something real. So did everything the myth left out. Fact 93. The city of Chongqing's experience of sustained bombing without surrender became a reference point for Allied strategists trying to understand what bombing could and could not achieve. The Japanese campaign had run for 5 years and had failed completely in its primary objective. The Chinese government did not surrender, did not relocate, did not collapse. This failure was noted by the same Allied air power theorists who were simultaneously planning the strategic bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan, and it should have prompted serious reconsideration of the assumptions underlying those campaigns. It largely did not, because the lessons that strategists drew from Chongqing tended to focus on the inadequacy of Japanese bombing techniques rather than on the fundamental resilience of civilian populations under sustained aerial attack. The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which assessed the results of Allied bombing campaigns against both Germany and Japan, found consistently that bombing had been far less effective at breaking civilian morale than its advocates had claimed, and that civilian populations had shown a consistent capacity to endure levels of destruction that pre-war theory had assumed would be psychologically unsustainable. Chongqing had demonstrated this a decade before the survey was written. The cities had already shown, at enormous cost, that the theory was wrong. The theory continued to be applied anyway, because sometimes the evidence arrives before the people in a position to act on it are ready to accept it. Fact 94. The city of Kyoto's survival, spared from the atomic bomb by Henry Stimson's personal intervention, has given the city a particular relationship with the nuclear age that is different from Hiroshima's and Nagasaki's but no less significant. Kyoto's residents know that their city was on the original target list. They know that the decision to spare it was made by one man, for reasons that mixed cultural appreciation with strategic calculation, and that the city of Nagasaki exists in Kyoto's place on the list of cities where atomic weapons were used. That knowledge, the knowledge of a near miss, of a catastrophe that came close and then turned aside, produces not the specific grief and trauma of the hibakusha, but a form of survivor's awareness, an understanding that the city's intact temples and gardens and living cultural traditions exist in a relationship with its absence from the target list that is not entirely comfortable to contemplate at length. Kyoto today is one of the best preserved historic cities in Japan, its temple complexes and traditional neighborhoods largely intact, its cultural heritage uninterrupted. That preservation is real and valuable. It is also the consequence of a decision that redirected destruction elsewhere rather than preventing it. The temples stand, Nagasaki remembers. Both things are part of the same story. Fact 95. The siege of Leningrad ended on January 27, 1944, when Soviet forces opened a land corridor to the city that broke the German encirclement after 872 days. The moment the siege was officially declared lifted, the city's surviving population gathered in streets and squares to hear the announcement and watch a fireworks display that the Soviet command had organized despite the very considerable practical difficulties of such a thing in a city that had just spent nearly 3 years being systematically starved. Survivors described the moment with a unanimity that suggests it was genuinely and overwhelmingly felt. Not simply relief, but something more complex and harder to name, a mixture of joy and grief, and the specific exhaustion of people who had been holding something together at enormous personal cost and were now finally permitted to put it down. The fireworks that lit the January sky over Leningrad on the night of January 27th were the first lights the city had shown deliberately at night since the blackout had begun in September 1941. 2.5 years of darkness ended in a deliberate blaze of color over a city that had paid an almost incomprehensible price for the right to illuminate itself again. The people watching from the streets had, on average, lost family members, friends and neighbors. They watched the fireworks, and they wept, and the weeping was for everything at once. Fact 96. The physical reconstruction of bombed European cities after the war was accompanied by a slower and less visible reconstruction of civic identity, the process by which communities that had been shattered, occupied, or destroyed rebuilt their understanding of who they were and what their city meant to them. Different cities approached this differently. Warsaw chose fidelity, rebuilding as close as possible to what had been there, insisting on continuity with a past that had been deliberately erased. Rotterdam chose transformation, building something modern on ground that had been cleared, treating the destruction as an opportunity rather than solely a loss. Coventry chose reconciliation, making the damage itself into a statement about the possibility of healing across former enmity. Dresden, divided by the Cold War, had 2 official narratives imposed on its destruction simultaneously and is still negotiating between them. Each choice reflected something real about the community making it, its values, its relationship with its own history, its understanding of what a city is for and what it owes to its past. The rebuilding of bombed cities was never purely architectural or economic. It was always also a question of identity, of what the people rebuilding the city believed about where they came from, what had been done to them, and who they intended to be going forward. Fact 97. The city of Guernica's name outlived the event that made it famous in a way that few other bombed cities can claim. Pablo Picasso's painting, completed in 1937, became the most widely reproduced anti-war image of the 20th century and ensured that the name Guernica was known globally in contexts far removed from the specific Basque market town and the specific April afternoon. The painting traveled from Paris to New York's Museum of Modern Art, where it remained for decades at Picasso's request, on the condition that it would not be returned to Spain until democracy was restored. It was returned in 1981, 6 years after Franco's death. A tapestry reproduction hangs outside the Security Council chamber at the United Nations headquarters in New York. In February 2003, when Colin Powell presented the United States case for the invasion of Iraq to the Security Council, the tapestry was covered with a blue curtain at the request of American officials who did not want the backdrop to Powell's speech to be an image of bombed civilians. The tapestry, the covering, and the reason for the covering together constitute a small and precise record of how the memory of what was done to Guernica continues to be inconvenient to people who need to do similar things. The painting kept asking the question, the curtain tried to close it. The question remained. Fact 98. The city of Berlin's division after the war, into occupation zones that eventually hardened into the division between East and West Berlin, created a new and prolonged form of the fear that had characterized the wartime years. The Berlin Wall, built in August 1961 to stop the mass exodus of East Germans to the west, divided streets, separated neighborhoods, and cut families apart with a physical barrier maintained by armed guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross without authorization. Approximately 140 people were killed attempting to cross the wall between 1961 and 1989. Families divided by the wall lived within a few kilometers of each other for decades, sometimes able to see each other across the barrier and entirely unable to meet. The fear that the wall produced in West Berlin, surrounded on all sides by East German territory, dependent on Allied guarantees, vulnerable to shifts in superpower calculation, was a different kind of fear from the wartime bombing, but it was fear nonetheless, sustained for 28 years. When the wall came down on November 9, 1989, the reunifications of families that took place at the crossing points were the direct continuation of separations that had begun in the rubble of 1945. Berlin's post-war division was the last long chapter of what the war had done to the city and its people. It ended on a November evening. People crossed, they embraced. The wall came down, one piece at a time. Fact 99. The cities that lived in constant fear during the Second World War left a physical record in the landscape that is still visible 8 decades later. In London, post-war buildings fitted into gaps in Victorian terrace rows mark where bombed houses were never rebuilt. In Warsaw, the old town that looks medieval is almost entirely a 1950s reconstruction. In Rotterdam, the modernist city centre is the direct consequence of 90 minutes of bombing in 1940. In Hiroshima, the A-bomb dome stands preserved as the only building left as it was on August 6, 1945. In Coventry, the ruins of the old cathedral and the walls of the new one stand together as a single structure. These physical marks are not always obvious to people who don't know what they are looking at. The rebuilt old town of Warsaw looks convincingly old. The modernist centre of Rotterdam looks like a deliberate architectural choice rather than a consequence of destruction. But the marks are there, written into the fabric of the cities in the materials and dates and forms of what was built after the war to replace what the war had removed. The cities carry their histories in their bodies, the same way the people who lived in them do, not always visibly, not always legibly to the uninformed eye, but permanently and indelibly, in the specific way that things that have been broken and carefully put back together always carry the line of the repair. Fact 100. The civilian populations of besieged and bombed cities demonstrated, collectively and repeatedly, that the theoretical basis of strategic bombing, the idea that sustained aerial attack on civilian populations would break morale and force governments to seek peace, was wrong. London did not break. Leningrad did not break. Chongqing did not break. Malta did not break. The cities that were most comprehensively destroyed, Warsaw, Stalingrad, Manila, were destroyed by combat and deliberate demolition rather than by the collapse of civilian will. The post-war strategic bombing surveys conducted by both the United States and Britain found consistently that bombing had been far less effective than its advocates had claimed, and that civilian populations had shown a resilience under aerial bombardment that pre-war theory had entirely failed to predict. This finding did not prevent the continuation of strategic bombing as a military doctrine. Nuclear weapons and the concept of shock and awe descend directly from the same theoretical lineage. But it meant that the theoretical justification for bombing civilian populations had been empirically tested at enormous human cost and had been found wanting. The cities that lived in constant fear during the war were in a sense the evidence base for that finding. They had paid for it with everything. And what they proved at that price was simply this: people are harder to break than anyone who hasn't tried to break them tends to believe. Fact 101. Every city in this series was, before the war came to it, simply a place where people lived. That is the fact that is easiest to lose sight of and the most important one to hold on to. London was a city of families and corner shops and parks before it was a city of air raid shelters and bomb sites. Leningrad was a city of concert halls and canals and ordinary daily life before it was a city of 125-gram bread rations and mass graves. Warsaw was a city of Jewish market traders and university students and children playing in courtyards before it was a city of ghetto walls and demolition charges. What the war did to these cities was not simply physical, it was the interruption of millions of ordinary lives by a violence that those lives had done nothing to invite. The people who sheltered in underground stations and carved tunnels into limestone cliffs and kept orchestras playing and rebuilt cathedrals and planted crosses of nails in burned ruins were not performing history. They were trying to live. They were trying to maintain the conditions of ordinary human existence: warmth, food, community, meaning, beauty, inside circumstances that were systematically destroying all of those things. That effort, sustained across years, across dozens of cities, across millions of individual lives, is not a footnote to the military history of the Second World War. It is the war's most essential story, and it belongs to the people who lived it. There's something that stays with you when you go through what these cities lived through. And it's not the statistics, it's the texture, the specific details, the metronome broadcasting on Leningrad's radio in the dark because silence itself was too frightening. The 12 seconds between a V1's engine cutting out and the explosion, and the impossible decision of what to do with those 12 seconds. The children in Malta who knew the tunnel network by feel. The workers in Stalingrad who built tanks and drove them straight from the factory floor into the battle outside. These details matter because they bring the experience down to a human scale, and the human scale is the only scale at which any of this can actually be understood. What strikes you most, going through all of it, is how wrong the people who designed the bombing campaigns were about what bombing would do to the people underneath it. The whole theory of strategic bombing, the idea that breaking cities would break the people in them, that destroying homes and neighborhoods would destroy the will to resist, turned out to be almost completely wrong in every city where it was seriously tested. London didn't break. Leningrad held for 872 days under conditions that should, by any reasonable calculation, have been unsurvivable. Malta absorbed a bomb load larger than the entire London Blitz on an island smaller than many cities, and the population endured it. Chongqing was bombed for 5 years, and the government didn't negotiate. The theory failed everywhere, and the failure cost millions of lives, the lives of the people being bombed, and eventually the lives of the people in German and Japanese cities who were bombed in return by campaigns built on the same flawed theory. The cities that were occupied rather than bombed had a different kind of fear. Quieter, more personal, more corrosive in certain ways because it had no explosions to organize the terror around. Paris under occupation was a city of identity checks and curfews and neighbors who might inform on you, and ration cards that weren't enough to live on, and the knowledge, after July 1942, that your Jewish neighbors were being taken, and you either helped or you didn't. Athens starved. Amsterdam watched its Jewish population disappear street by street. Kyiv had Babi Yar. These cities weren't destroyed. You could walk through them after the war and find the buildings largely standing. But something had happened to them that was in some ways harder to rebuild than the physical fabric of a bombed city, because it had happened between people rather than to buildings. And then there are the cities that got both. Warsaw above all, which was bombed in 1939, occupied, ghettoed, had its Jewish population deported and its resistance uprising suppressed, and then, finally, systematically demolished building by building on Hitler's personal order, so that Soviet forces in January 1945 walked into rubble rather than a city. Warsaw's story is so extreme that it barely fits within the same category as London or Paris or even Leningrad. And yet all of these cities are part of the same history, the same fundamental fact that the Second World War was conducted on and through civilian spaces with civilian populations inside them. What all of these cities shared was the experience of fear as a sustained condition rather than an acute event, not the sharp, brief terror of a single moment, but the low, chronic, daily weight of not knowing when the next raid would come, whether the person knocking was a neighbor or a soldier, whether the ration card would be enough. People built lives inside that fear. They raised children inside it. They kept schools running inside it, performed concerts and maintained libraries and ran black markets and fell in love and had arguments about ordinary things and kept going, day after day, in conditions that peace had given them no preparation for. That capacity, the human capacity to adapt to conditions that should be unendurable, to maintain the forms and practices of ordinary life inside environments of sustained destruction, is the thing that these cities demonstrate most clearly. The resilience of people trying to keep their children fed, their communities functioning, their cities recognizable as human places. That resilience is one of the most important things the war left behind. Not a lesson exactly, just evidence. Evidence of what people are capable of when the world they knew stops holding. As you rest now, let these facts settle quietly. The metronome beat on, the orchestra played, the walls of the cathedral still stand, old stone and new stone together. The children who hid in the tunnels grew up. The city of Warsaw was rebuilt, street by careful street, from paintings made 200 years before the destruction. Everything was broken. Almost everything was, eventually, put back together. And now you rest, warm and still, very far from all of that, carrying nothing heavier than the knowledge that people have endured remarkable things and have, most of the time, found their way through. Breathe deeply. Let the cities fade gently into the distance where they belong. Let the stories blur into a quiet background warmth. There is nothing required of you now, only rest, only the slow, unhurried descent into sleep that your body has been waiting for. Good night, sleep deeply, sleep well. The night is quiet, you are safe, and the long story of the cities has, for tonight, reached its gentle end.